Good morning. So we're going to continue with the International Conference 1939, Spain exports aerial terror to Europe. Welcome everyone to this second session, this second day, that we're going to start sharing the information of the new European program that includes all the financing for the memory projects. We have here with us Carolina Fenoll, which represents the European point of contact of the citizenship, rights and values. This is the name of the new European program for the foreseeable future. So she's a technician of the European point of citizenship in the Cultural and Sport Minister. She has a big experience in the public and private sectors, and she's part of this organization that in Spain gives consultation to the different organizations in the program of Creative Europe and this other program that I mentioned before. We have a very good experience of collaboration with the whole team of this European point, and they suggested that she came here today to do her presentation, and we think that is great to provide this information to all the people who is following us to get interesting projects and share this common memory between Europeans. So I give the floor to Carolina. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank José María, Soraya, all the team in the Anastasia de Gracia Foundation and the European members of this project, and also to congratulate them because it has been selected by its quality. And I think this project, as many others of historic memory, is very needed in our country especially. So I'm going to start by giving you a few strokes on the program that replaced the previous program, Europe with the Citizens. But it is going to involve more issues, and it's going to have higher budgets. So we will have an array of opportunities for the organizations that work in this realm of historic memory. The program is called Citizens, Quality, Rights and Values, and has three main goals: to protect and foster the rights and values enshrined in the treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the international treaties, but also to support especially the organizations of the civil society and other stakeholders locally, regionally, nationally, and cross-nationally to foster this democratic participation and civic participation, and as an aim to promote this open society, good governance, and the rule of law. These values that define us as European Union. As I was saying, this program comes from the previous program of Europe with Citizens and the program with rights, equality, and citizenship. So how do we manage this? Is a European Commission program that is managed by the Law General Directorate and the European Agency, the Executive European Agency, that is in charge of the new law program, which is an independent program, and also the Values and Rights Forum. So the schedule for this program was approved, and the 5th of May, the rules were approved, the norms were approved. So the great news is that thanks to the effort of everyone institutionally, from the European Commission, but also the European Parliament, we have been able to have high funding for this program, which is this one of 1,550 million euros. Is a bigger funding compared to the previous program. This is an achievement, and it's going to bring a great deal of opportunity. So the program is divided in 4 chapters that correspond to the 4 goals, and is related to several issues. First of all, to the one that relates to the values in the European Union, the one enshrined in the Article 2 of the European Union Treaty, and the second chapter to promote rights, non-discrimination, equality, especially gender equality, and to foster this perspective of gender and the non-discrimination. And the third chapter that I'm going to focus on today is to promote commitment and the active participation of the citizens, trying to be aware of our European history. And the fourth chapter comes from the previous program related with the fight against domestic violence. So this program covers a number of issues. There are probably other issues that are not here, including historic memory, fight against racism, xenophobia, the gender equality, rights for the European citizens, etc. So what are the member states? The program has just been approved, and nowadays those who can apply are the 27 member states. But little by little, we're going to be including other countries that can sign the treaty as the countries of the economic European space, and we were having Albania, Macedonia, North Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro. So who can ask for this funding? There could be differences regarding each chapter, but mainly it's NGOs that promote the rights and values of the European Union. Of course, its mission as an organization has to be coherent and be aligned with the goals and aims and chapters of the program. So public organizations can ask for this funding locally, regionally, nationally, and cross-nationally. Citizen organizations, brotherhood organizations, education entities, and international organizations as well, and civil society organizations. So we are the international point of contact. It's an office within the Cultural Ministry, as they were saying, in the General Directorate or Cultural Cooperation, Culture, and Intellectual Property. We are an office that offers services, free services, always, to inform about the funding, and we also give consultancy, free consultancy, to prepare their proposals. We revise their proposals, and also we give assistance to find European partners, and we organize a series of activities, informative sessions, and also training sessions to help disseminate the programs, and so that the candidates can improve the results in the different calls. So the funding chapters of this program, as I was saying, are based in these 4 chapters, but I'm going to focus in the ones that specifically mean opportunities for the European historic memory. First of all, the first chapter, Values of the Union, has specific aims to protect and promote regarding rights, giving support to the organizations in civil society, and with this final aim of contributing to the construction of a more democratic union with a democratic dialogue, transparency, and good governance. We have a series of opportunities here for the historic memory. specifically with operative funding. I'm going to talk about this in more detail later on, but I wanted to tell you about the names of the calls because the deadline is at the end of this month. And even though there are 2 open calls, it's just the one funding. It's just a framework for 4 years, and this is the first year, so you need to ask for the specific funding to work on the first year. And as I was saying, there are opportunities also in the 3rd chapter of commitment and citizen participation, which is the program of Europe with Citizens, and in the 3 specific goals that relate to the funding as well. In the first one, we have these opportunities, remembering the decisive moments of the modern European history and raising awareness in the citizenship about the common values and cultural values and heritage. So here we have a line called European Historic Memory, and that is open until the 22nd of June. It's help funding for different projects. And this year as well, we're going to have a second round of calls, which will be published between September and December in the last quarter of the year, and in the funding would be higher than the one that we have in the current call. So if you would like to apply to it, I encourage you to do so. So I'm not going to enter into very technical details, but just to give you an idea, everything is done from the new portal of participants. I think you know this new portal from the European Commission and Tender Opportunity Program, and the part of implementation of the different projects. So here you can check the calls that are available and all the documentation. There is a very interesting section looking for different partners in Europe for the different calls. For the call of projects of history memory, there are more than 50 proposals in Europe to participate in projects to find organizations that are interested in participating in one of these initiatives. So I encourage you also to check this in our website. In the European Point for Citizens, we have a specific page in which you can check the manuals and tutorials that facilitate the process. And we, as points of contact, we can help you with how to check this portal. So we help those of you who contact us. So I'm going to get into more detail regarding the funding. The deadline was for this call is in 22nd of June. It has a budget of 4.5 million euros, and the goal, as I was saying, is decisive moments of our history to raise awareness in our citizens so that about our history and cultural values, and to improve the knowledge of the European Union. There are 2 priorities, and you need to highlight one of them. First of all, commemorate, educate about the crimes under the totalitarian regimes, especially the Holocaust, but also genocide and crimes against humanity. With this idea, or special idea, to be able to get accounts and research so that we can turn this into pedagogical tools that can extend to the whole of society, and by the use of multiplier agents, opinion leaders, politicians, the leaders of civil society organizations. The second priority is related to the resilience and the organized groups, resistance and organized groups that were there during the occupation, and other issues to do with the democratic process, the democratic consolidation of the countries that were going to join the European Union, and how this process helped the democratic development as a country. So these contents are based in political initiatives from the European Union, like the European strategy against anti-Semitism. We are still preparing this, and it will be ready at the end of this year, and also the action plan against racism and the strategy for the Romani collective for inclusion and participation. So as I was saying, you can ask for this. All the legal entities, those that are registered within the elected members, which are the 27 member states, can ask for it in the city halls, public, regional authorities, and also NGOs, civil society organizations, survival organizations, cultural and education organizations that work in this sphere in terms of research. What activities can be done or can be funded? So we recommend that there is a variety of activities with the idea to reach a wider audience and to be able to innovate. So the possibilities are huge. So research, training, education, non-formal education, public debates, campaigns, surveys, projection of documentaries, even filmmaking for accounts. Also to digitalize these accounts, and also other archives, the digitalization of archives of historic memory, webinars, online tools, and any other innovative actions that can help to increase the impact of these actions, always with the goal of fostering this culture of historic memory that a lot of countries haven't developed as much yet, and to help this mutual understanding. We talked about stopping the distortion of certain aspects of history, negationism, and other important aspects, the accessibility to for all these activities. We need to reach the wider audience, gender-wise, age, and their social environment. So that they are developed cross-nationally. It's not compulsory to get a European partner in this funding call, but you need two organizations. They could be from the same country, but it is recommendable that it's cross-national, that it covers a wider area geographically to increase this impact. The project can be from 1 to 2 years, and the budget is calculated in a very easy way. There is not a maximum amount, but just to give you an idea, in the previous program, the higher amount was 100,000 euros. I think because of the funding we have this year is about that amount, but it could be even a higher amount. And even in the next call, it will be around 7 million euros, the funding for that call, and maybe we will be able to fund more projects. And the funding is calculated based on the number of participants that are going to be invited, direct participants, and the number of eligible countries. They could be on physical events or online events, and the ideal way to do this is by combining them too, and it will be 60% of the total cost of the projects. So the application has 3 parts if you do it from the portal that I showed you before, but in the international points of contact we can help you. I don't know how much time I've got left. I think I'm doing okay. But just lastly, just to talk about the possibilities for operative help this year, you need to ask in parallel funding for the framework convention and the specific ones for the first year to start working in 2022. The deadline is very close by, first for the framework, and once you have done that, you need to ask for the annual funding. So the goal of this funding is to promote, raise awareness about the rights in the Union, giving funding to the civil society organizations that are locally regionally or nationally, and also cross-nationally, to promote these rights. That's the idea, to reinforce protection and promotion of our values and to contribute to this more democratic European Union and good governance. Who can ask for this funding? Also, legal entities, private ones, non-profit that belong to a member state, and it should be only one applicant, and their statutory regulations have to be in accordance with the program. We need to finance the operation costs of European networks, organizations of the civil society or think tanks that add value to the Europe, and this allows us to fund a different array of activities, analysis, training, organizing conferences like this one, exchange good practices, best practices, make awareness sessions. So specifically for those organizations who are going to work in this priority of historic memory, the budget is 1.7 million euros, and the applicants can be networks organized at a European level with organizations of at least 14 European member states, or civil society organizations active in Europe, or European think tanks. Just to give you a few details about the results of the previous period, at a European level, we financed 278 projects. 17 of those were led by Spanish organizations, and 60 of those projects had the participation of Spanish organizations. So I gave you here the link to check the previous results if you need inspiration, of course. And just finally, just leaving you the details here of our webpage, which is belongs to the Culture and Sport Ministry. And also this is the page in English of the platform, where you can check the specific information for the program, and you can also access the documentation and content of all the calls. So I encourage you to follow our newsletter, to know about the different calls and the different activities that we organize. These are our social media, phone number and webpage, and the international points of contacts are here to help you and give you information. And I really encourage you to carry on developing and presenting historic memory projects. Thank you very much.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta o pasamos de...
I don't know if there are any questions. You would like to go to the next speaker? Thank you very much, Carolina. So before we continue with Thomas Hippler presentation, I would like to remind you again, to those of you who are following us through the social media, please use the hashtag 1939 aerial terror to share your thoughts. And also, now Thomas Hippler and the rest of the speakers are going to speak in English or Italian. Outside, you have the translation system in case you need it for Italian, and also for Spanish if you need it, or English. And those of you who are watching from home, in the profile of our foundation in YouTube, there will be a version in English for those of you who can follow it in Spanish. First of all, just to let you know, and we have now here Thomas Hippler. He's now connected. Hello, Thomas.
Can you hear me? Yeah, perfectly. Sorry, I speak in Spanish to...
That is very far. Okay.
And I'm just trying to catch a few words. That is fine.
Okay, thank you. Os presento a Thomas Hippler, él es profesor de la Universidad
Thomas Hippler is professor at Caen University, and he's the author of a book which caught our interest in order to talk about the framework of this conference. And let me read directly: Governing from the Sky, a history of aerial bombing, which deals with how the last war of the 20th century and how the aerial craft takes as a hostage the civil population. Thomas Hippler is going to round off the vision we gave yesterday at the conference, talking about the onset, the origin of this aerial strategy. And I give him the floor in order to talk about the perspective of 1919 and 1939, the Italian perspective on the aerial bombing.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to the organizers. And I will have to kick up with a series of apologies. First of all, for being utterly unable to express myself in Spanish. I can understand a little bit, but I'm utterly unable to speak. Secondly, I would like to apologize for not being there and present in Madrid. I would have loved to, and I was actually very much looking forward. But there's a course of COVID in my family, no worries to have at all. Everybody's very fine, but I'm just not allowed to go out. There's certainly no need to spell this out in more details to you guys in Spain. You're very well aware of these points. Moreover, my presentation today will be a little bit, let's say, perhaps eccentric with regard to the general topic of the conference, since I will not really be talking about Spain, but not more particularly about Italy. To be sure, there will be some mention of Spain, but the title of the talk is what you can see here, Douhet and Beyond, the Italian outlook on air bombing are between, let's say, the First and the Second World War. More precisely, I would like to center my presentation on two main protagonists. The first of them hardly needs an introduction, I suppose. Julie Douhet being quite well known as a theorist of aerial warfare. The second one, Amedeo Micozzi, is perhaps a little less known. And this is why I will not dwell in any length on Douhet and will rather limit myself to briefly discuss 3 points of his theorizing that I think are important. The first one, I will discuss the articulation of politics and strategy, or to put it bluntly, can Douhetism, that is the option of targeting civilian populations, be explained by Douhet's espousal of a fascist ideology? And my blunt answer to this is that no, this is not a suitable explanation and such. In a second and third step, which will be much briefer, I will briefly talk about the issue of targeting in Douhet and then come to the concept of the battle plane, which is a rather technical issue, but I will talk about this very quickly. Before talking in a second step on my second main protagonist, which is Amedeo Micozzi, and I will first say a few words about the man himself, and some graphical elements, and then locating his strategic contribution within the context of the Italian discussions of the time, and here we will come to Spain finally, pointing to some of his theoretical innovations in the context precisely of the war in Spain. Right, so my first point, so politics and strategy in Douhet. So Douhet is quite commonly known as the author of the strategic option of terror bombing against civil populations. And one explanation that has been offered to consider to explain Douhetism is to consider Douhetism in line with fascist ideology. Now, this is an explanation that most prominently has been developed by Arthur Gatt in his third volume of his Military of History Thought, and it is without any doubt true that Douhet was a supporter of Italian fascism. So he was a fascist, no doubt about that. I'm, however, quite skeptical of any explanations that would precisely explain the theoretical options of his in the light of this commitment for political fascism. The reasons are, well, there are two main reasons for this. The first one being, if we look at the bigger picture, it appears quite clearly that the strategic option of targeting civil populations was by no means simply employed by fascist statecraft. During the Second World War in particular, is certainly no exaggeration to say that it was quite on the contrary. Liberal democracies like the United Kingdom and the United States of America that very heavily employed strategic bombing against civil populations, and precisely not fascist countries. And second, a closer look on the intellectual history of strategic thought, and this is what I will be focusing on today, reveals quite clearly that Douhet, as himself, as a sort of prime example of this, started his career as a military writer with a liberal and perhaps even a pacifistic stance, which is something that is a bit less known perhaps. Before the First World War, he thus explicitly argued against targeting of civil populations, both on moral and on political grounds, and he even called for an international convention to outlaw war from the air altogether. He even goes further, calling for what he calls an international tribunal, that is a supranational power, capable of preventing war altogether. And the first arguments in favor of bombing missions can be found in Douhet's writing during the First World War, and more precisely in November 1917, his argument being the following. On the one hand, the enormous potential of destruction of aerial bombing needs international regulation. And on the other hand, this international tribunal he's been talking about for some time needs teeth and claws, that is, a coercive power at its disposal. And this is precisely where the solution is precisely that the supranational power be given its own air forces as a means to carry out coercive action. That is, the idea of aerial bombing, as a positive reference to aerial bombing, appears in Douhet's thought not at all as a consequence of his political commitment for the sake of fascism,
pero no aparece como consecuencia de su compromiso político con el fascismo.
But on the contrary, it is in a line of thought quite in a liberal tradition, and even quite close, paradoxically, to democratic cosmopolitanism.
Y bastante cercano al cosmopolitanismo democrático.
So I'm well aware that this argument might seem very counterintuitive.
Quizás este argumento pueda parecer un poco contrario a lo que dictaría el sentido común.
And unfortunately, I will not have the time to spell this out in some detail here, but for those of you who might be interested, will be very happy to provide some papers where the argument is precisely spelled out in more detail. But I will rather come to my second point on Douhet, which is rather, here we are, which is rather short. As everybody knows, the title of Douhet's main work is Il dominio dell'aria, the command of the air.
es el dominio dell'area.
And the command of the air is indeed one of his key concepts.
Uno de sus conceptos núcleo.
And the idea obviously stems from an application of the naval theory of Alfred Thayer Mahan, so of this concept of sea power, to the domain of aviation. And it signifies quite bluntly the capacity to fly where one wants to fly and to prevent the enemy from flying.
Y evitar que el enemigo sobrevuele ciertas áreas.
In order to gain this command of the air, it might be necessary, and this is a constant theme in Douhet's reasoning too, it might be necessary to fight in the air. In other words, command of the air is primarily concerned with war in the air. And as you can easily see, there is an inherent tension between war in the air and war from the air. And this is indeed a constant theme in Douhet's writing from 1910 onwards, his first writings about aviation, until his death in 1930. And concerning the question of targeting, he writes in the first edition of his main work, Il dominio dell'area. This is a translation, a quote from the English translation. I quote, "As a matter of fact, the selection of targets, the grouping of zones, and determining the order in which they are to be destroyed is the most difficult and delicate task in modern warfare, constituting what may be defined as aerial strategy. Objectives, and this is important, vary considerably in war, and their choice depends chiefly upon the aim thought, whether the command of the air, paralyzing the enemy's army and navy, or shattering the morale of civilians behind the lines." And here the translation admits another possibility, which is to carry out missions against the directive organs of the country, that is, centers of military and political decision-making. And this choice may therefore be guided by a great many considerations, political, social, and psychological, depending upon the conditions of the moment. Anyway, the reason why I'm giving this long quote is that in contrast to what is often believed, the issue of targeting is much more complicated in Douhet, and explicitly, to some extent, leaves it open. The argument is, my argument here is, that it would be an error to consider Douhetism just as the option to target civil populations.
Opción que meramente se circunscribe a lanzar un ataque objetivo o lanzar un ataque que tiene como objetivo la población civil.
Right. Even more briefly, my third point on Douhet, his concept of the battle plane. This is a rather technical issue, and I will can come back in the discussion if you'd like. The crucial innovation between the first and the second edition of his main work, Il dominio dell'area, that is between 21 and 26, lies in the concept of the battle plane, in which Douhet seeks to go beyond this dichotomy of war in the air and war from the air I've just been talking about. And this is why the battle plane comes in. This is a very heavy aircraft, capable of both firing in all directions and of carrying large amount of bomb. And accordingly, with this technical innovation, it would not be necessary anymore, within Douhet's framework of reasoning, to seek for supremacy in the air in the first step, before being able to carry out missions against the ground in a second step. You will see in a moment why I talked about this point, but before doing so, I will come now to my second part of the presentation and talk about my second protagonist, Amedeo Micozzi.
Amedeo Micozzi.
So in the first step, I will say a few words about the man, give some biographical elements, then locate his thought within the context of the Italian air power discussions, and lastly, talk about his ideas within the context of the Spanish War.
La guerra aérea Italia y también a la luz de la guerra en España.
So Amedeo Micozzi, which is certainly less well known as Douhet, was 23 years younger than his protagonist Douhet, had also a quite different background. While Douhet came from a wealthy and educated family with a long tradition of military service in officer ranks, Micozzi was born into a working class neighborhood. He was quite early on orphaned, unable to pursue his education beyond secondary school level, and thus joined the army. Just before the breaking out of the First World War, was sent to Eritrea, and came back to Italy when the country joined the war in 1915. Was then enrolled, became a pilot, and served at the front during almost the whole duration of the war, and became a decorated air ace, and all of his career, military career, was due precisely to his technical and military performance, which is very different from Douhet's background.
Militar, lo cual es una trayectoria distinta con respecto a la de Douhet.
He thus became an officer towards the end of the war. He was had a much slower career than Douhet, and as just pointed out, he had a concrete experience in flying. Once more, in contrast to Douhet, who considered piloting as a subaltern term for non-commissioned officers. And he also had experienced the vulnerability of aircraft being almost shot down a couple of times.
De los aviones porque fue disparado sobre uno en diversas ocasiones.
It was then during Italo Balbo's tenure as in the Air Office that he became one of his main collaborators. Made them a quite brilliant career in these years, published a couple of books I will come to a bit later, which then informed quite importantly Italian air strategy, arguably much more than Douhet did, and arguably also much more than Douhet with regard precisely to the Spanish War. A couple of years later, he was transferred to Somalia, stayed there for a year, and then became director of the Rivista Aeronautica, that is the Air Force journal in Italy, occupying a key position in a theoretical debate within the Italian Air Force. Within there is certainly a bit of a political conversion during the end years of fascism. So during the German occupation of Rome, he went underground, hiding papers and also money, and did not reappear until the liberation of the city by the Allied forces. And during the emerging civil war, he opposed Italy's adhesion to NATO, arguing for a policy of unarmed neutrality for Italy.
Y durante la Guerra Fría emergente se opuso a la adhesión italiana a la OTAN, diciendo que había que optar por la neutralidad y el desarme en Italia.
He criticized American leadership in Pluto-democracy, and that's what I called it, and was then quite quickly dismissed from the Rivista Aeronautica, accused of leftism.
De la Rivista Aeronautica, acusado de izquierdismo.
And was increasingly isolated, did not publish anything until the what came to be his main work, Guerra agli inermi ed aviazione d'assalto, so War on the Unarmed and Assault Aviation. And he died in 1971 in Rome.
1971 en Roma.
So quite interesting character and not much studied, but definitely an interesting military character. So I'll come to the second point here, to his contributions within the context of the Italian strategic discussions. And sorry, that was too quick here. No, okay. He positioned himself basically between Douhetism on the one hand, and to a large extent against Douhet, and on the other hand, against another important current in military thought in Italy, that is the Bernotti school of the aero-naval current, that basically try to subordinate the use of air power to the needs of, most importantly, the navies, hence the name, but also to armed forces on the ground, which is pretty much the same. And so his basically first concern, this is a constant theme in these early air power discussions, is to secure institutional independence of the Air Force. Might come as a bit of a surprise, but it's a very important thing for all these discussions. Is basically a rivalry between air officers and ground and naval forces on the other hand. In the long run, Micozzi himself positioned himself or stylized himself as essentially the anti-Douhet, the one that had always been argued against the targeting of civil populations in modern war. But this is not entirely true. That is, it is much truer that he tried to get rid of some of the exaggerations of Douhetism and what was perceived as exaggerations by his fellow officers in the armed forces, in order to provide of something of a more realistic framework of reasoning. And this is why he did certainly not rule out bombing missions against civil populations. And there is a constant temptation of Douhetism, as I termed it, in Micozzi's writings, which can be summed up in the following way. That is, trying to justify the institutional independence of the Air Force within the framework of Benotti's concept of the aeronaval and aeroterrestrial as two distinct spheres of action, Micozzi encounters the difficulty of defining a sphere of action in which the Air Force alone is able to act. And that is a sphere that cannot be reached by armies or navies. And all this precisely in order to establish firmly the institutional independence that he deems necessary. And this precisely means, and this is my last point on my PowerPoint, the bombing missions against the hinterland, behind the front, the coastal lines, communication lines, energy supply, industrial production, but also people's morale. Or to put it in Micozzi's own words, these autonomous air missions have to be missions contro nazione. So as a consequence, we must considerably qualify Micozzi's own affirmations that he's always been a firm detractor of Douhetian terror bombings. This is not true. But the future lies, according to him, in a different direction that is not on heavy bombing planes, as I just pointed out with regard to Douhet, but a much smaller, much more maneuverable material that is able to bomb, certainly, and also to bomb civil populations if necessary, but in a much more precise way. So this is here also a sort of clear disavowal of Douhet's material-centered approach, and on the horizon we see something of an antagonism between Jomini and Clausewitz, which to a great extent structures the debate between Douhet and Micozzi. I will now come to my last point here. So lessons from the war in Spain for the nature of warfare and of targeting. And it is precisely in this context that Douhet developed and refined his ideas about the technical specificities of how air warfare should be carried out. His main concepts here are volo rasente, that is flying very low in 15 meters above the ground, and in also carrying out missions of precision bombing on very selected targets. I will not go much more into technical discussions here, which are important, without any doubt, but rather try to hint to the bigger picture here. The important difference with Douhet lies in the actual choice of targets, not in the sense that Micozzi would rule out attacks against civil populations, but in the sense that he would argue for precision bombing of small but vital targets. As examples, he enumerates communication lines, straits, railways, power stations, dams, and dikes. So on an abstract level, they would agree on the principle of using the greatest force at the point where the enemy is the weakest, but they differ in their conception of what these weak points are. And in contrast to Douhet, puts the emphasis nevertheless quite considerably on the fragility of civilian morale and on social cohesion. Micozzi holds that attacks on targets remote from the immediate war effort are also likely to have only a remote influence on this precise war effort. And it thus remains true that Micozzi is increasingly skeptical of the usefulness of attacks on civil populations. And there are several reasons for this. And among these reasons are, according to Micozzi, the experiences of the Ethiopian and, most importantly, of the Spanish War, that tend to show that civilian morale is more resistant or more resilient than theorists like Douhet are inclined to think. And as a practical result of this kind of mission, bombing missions against civil populations is zero.
El resultado práctico de este tipo de misiones dirigidas contra la población es cercano a cero.
And he even warns that bombing missions against civil populations might politically or diplomatically be disastrous and on the overall grand strategic level counterproductive.
Y además pueden ser contraproducentes incluso en la batalla librada por las fuerzas, por el ejército de tierra.
So, as a consequence of all this, the involvement of the Italian aviation in the war in Spain was actually perceived by military commentators of the time as a testing ground for Douhet's concepts. And a French military commentator, Camille Rougeron, put it in these words, and that you can see here on the PowerPoint, that, I quote, "The Italian aviation serving the Spanish nationalists have just brought into general use a method for air raids that is diametrically opposed to that advocated by Douhet." And this is not the only divergence. It was in Italy too, partly spurred on by General Mecozzi and in complete contradiction to Douhet's theory, that a specialty referred as assault aviation appeared, proving of great interest in the Spanish War.
Ahí fue cuando surgió el concepto de aviación de asalto.
So, moreover, in contrast to Douhet, whose understanding of war is inherently national, Mecozzi predicts that future wars might be quite different in character.
Las guerras del futuro pueden cobrar un carácter distinto.
So, firstly, it is quite likely according to him, that coalition wars will be the rule. And secondly, according to Douhet, it is likely, and here you see my quote, that they will resemble civil wars. Inasmuch as this current civil war in Spain is already an international war. But furthermore, many indicators suggest that the next European war will also have the character of a civil war, by which certain nations, for example France or Spain, will be divided into two opposing factions, each strongly allied to a different group of nations, and this will not be perhaps a war between fatherlands, but a war between ideals, as everybody terms their own beliefs, and ideologies, as everybody calls the beliefs of others.
No será una guerra entre tierras patrias, sino una guerra librada entre ideas e ideologías.
So, future wars will thus be at once bigger than limited national wars, because they implicated more than just two nations. So, both bigger, but also smaller on another scale, because they will bear characteristics of civil wars precisely. Their object will not be just kind of national interest, but they will largely be driven by ideological factors. And so it is quite interesting to observe the coherence between Mecozzi's more technical considerations about the carrying out of air warfare and these more encompassing theoretical or political or even philosophical, if you want, considerations. At the same time, and I will finish with that, the interweaving of the characteristics of civil war with the organized forces of states will create new forms of warfare that are today referred to as hybrid forms of warfare. Once again, Mecozzi appears quite perspicacious in his forecasts than many of his opponents, and some of his insights from the 1930s onwards actually bear resemblance to strategic concepts that are today under the label of hybrid warfare, that is a blending of conventional and irregular approaches, including combinations of civil wars, insurgency, and eventually what can be called terrorism. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we have some time to get into a discussion. I would very much look forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Lamento que no haya tiempo para...
I'm sorry we don't have time for questions. We need to move on with the conference. And we thank you for your clear intervention about the origins of what was happening in our country. Thank you so much for your participation. We hope to see you here soon. So we're going to continue with this conference. Now we're going to hear from Professor Charles Heimberg. We hope that he's already here, ready to connect. I'm going to introduce Professor Heimberg. He's a historian and professor of history and citizen education in the University of Geneva, specialist in the history of the working movement and the learning of the history and the recovery of the historic memory. He writes in the press and he has a blog, a very interesting blog that I recommend to you all. It's the blog entitled A School of Clio, dedicated to history and to teaching history. And he collaborates with the Resistance Museum in an area of Switzerland. Charles Heimberg, if we can get him connected. Good morning, Charles. Good morning. Can you hear me? Welcome to the conference. I'm going to give you the floor. Charles Heimberg is going to talk to us about the air raid as an object of learning and reflection on human rights. Charles, the floor is yours.
Se per caso mi sarebbe possibile avere il partage d'écran per mettere il piano
Se potessi condividere lo schermo per presentarmi.
To present, if you could please put my presentation on screen because it's blocked. I think the computer has frozen. It's frozen. It doesn't matter.
No, vamos a ver.
Okay, let's see.
Seguimos.
Let's move forward.
El bombardeo
So, the aerial bombing
se trata de una situación un poco complicada
was a complicated situation.
porque hablo en italiano por un tema que está escrito en francés.
I speak in Italian and this is written in French, so it's a bit difficult for me to express myself. But the title of the presentation, the aerial bombing
como objeto de enseñanza
as
y
a
aprendizaje sobre derechos humanos.
learning object and reflection on human rights.
La guerra aérea,
So the aerial
por el
bombing,
fotógrafo
represented by Robert Capa, is an icon for the conflicts in the 21st century.
Yo no soy un especialista de la historia de estos bombardeos.
I am not an expert in the history of these bombings.
Y esto será
And
claro, lo veréis
you will
cuando
see
hable
this
con vosotros
clearly
después de Thomas Hitler, cuya obra
because you're
es
going to hear me after
uno de
listening
los
to
principales
Thomas
especialistas.
Hippler, and he's one of the main experts in the
Al
issue.
principio de su libro
So,
sobre la
at
historia
the
del
beginning of the
bombardeo
book,
aéreo,
of his book,
ahora
on the
sabéis
history of the
que
bombing,
hace mención de
you
Italia,
know that he mentioned
por ejemplo, el teniente
Italy,
italiano Giulio Gavotti, que
Giulio
lanza
Gavotti,
una bomba
the
con su
lieutenant, that
propia mano
launches a bomb
en
with
un
his own
campo
hands in a
libio
Libyan field.
el 11 del siglo pasado. Se oye muy mal. Los bombardeos
In the past century.
durante las guerras
So the
coloniales
bombings through the colonial
precedieron las bombas fascistas
period preceded the fascist bomb on the civil population in Spain during the Civil War. And this way of doing war
ha sido increíblemente violenta.
has been incredibly violent.
Llevó a la masacre desenfrenada de la población civil.
There was a big massacre of the civil population, and that's why the history of aerial bombing,
Se ha quedado
and excuses for the sound, is really bad, but we're trying to do our best,
tal vez no todos
has
los
belonged
bombardeos de la
to
Segunda
the
Guerra
collective
Mundial.
memory, because maybe not all the bombings in the Second World War were fascist.
Y el historiador
And the
americano
American
Howard Zinn,
historian Howard Zinn
él mismo había
himself
participado
participated
al
in the
bombardeo
bombing of
de Francia, cerca de
France
Bordeaux,
near
en
Bordeaux in
1945.
1945,
Puso en
and
tela de juicio su justificación
he doubted
en
his
sentido antifascista.
justification in the sense of anti-fascism. And this terror, since then, this terror from the sky, as you
Nuestra conferencia
call this aerial terror, which is also the title of this conference, was
en un puesto
used vastly
colosal,
vastly, with a great cost in terms of casualties, and its history
merece ser conocida y
should be
enseñada
known and should be taught
para poder examinar sus
to be able to examine the consequences and to generate also
un compromiso
an
internacional.
international commitment.
Y este es mi punto de partida.
And this is the starting point of my presentation.
La primera parte de mi presentación
The first part of my presentation is
punto de vista
a
por la parte de la historia
point of
social
view
y de la didáctica de la historia.
the social dimension and the
Yo soy
teaching
historiador,
of history. I'm a historian. I'm a historian of the working movement.
pero también
But
histórico de
also,
la
I'm a historian
pedagogía
of the
de libertad
pedagogy of freedom
y de la enseñanza de la historia.
and the teaching of history.
Trabajé en los museos de historias de la
We
guerra
work in the
mundiales.
history museums of the world wars, and I was interested in this part in museums.
Un concepto en
A
el que
concept
encontramos la reconstrucción de
in
una
which
narración
we find the
histórica
reconstruction of a historic narration that can communicate the reflections,
más relevantes entre
the most
el pasado.
relevant reflections between the past and the present.
También soy didáctico de la historia.
Also teach history in the wider sense.
Trabajo en un campo
So I work in a field,
reciente y frágil.
in a recent field that is very
La
fragile,
legitimidad
and the
contextada
legitimacy
por los
of
que
this
piensan que
field
el
is argued by those who
trabajo
think
de
that the work
profesor de
of
historia
teaching history
se aprende con espontaneidad
is learned
y
spontaneously
la acumulación de
and by accumulating practical experience.
de hecho
And in fact, this
se hace frágil
teaching
por la
becomes
representación
fragile because of the illusions represented of a discipline
sería
that
suficiente enunciar de forma lineal
could be talked about in a linear way,
cuando se trata en realidad de una
when
ciencia
in
social
reality it's a social science,
cuyos objetos de estudio
and the main object of study
conciernen la transmisión
involves the communication of the inintelligibility of the past and the present
que son
that are
especialmente
especially complex by themselves.
y también con referencia al gran histórico
And with regards to the great
Mark Bloch,
historian Mark Bloch,
Carlo
Carlo
Gisborne intentado
Gisborne
recientemente
had tried recently to
describir los mecanismos
describe the
siguientes de la
following mechanisms in history, the subsequent mechanisms in history between the past and the present. To simplify this, I would say that in the years that I've been teaching history, is overall to recognize that the practice of history starts always from the present. The present asks questions to the past with his own words. And from its own universe. And at the heart of history's work, you can find the process of placing yourself in the past, however special that may be, and also in the uncertainties of the subsequent presence, so that we can try to build an answer or create an answer for the questions that come up. So the idea is coming from the past and having answers from the past. And the next problem is about and the problem is about not only extracting answerings and lessons to learn, but articulate reflections that can take into account the fact that confrontation over history is absolutely vital for this discipline. And it has to leave aside the two dangers of assimilation, the past that would repeat itself, the old stance that want to completely separate all the space-time context in history, as you can see. I try not to simplify the practice and the communication of history. Some lessons that history should impose in the present as a norm. History is not here just to give lessons to learn. History and historic memory should be productive, create intelligibility, and compare and confront with the problems and contradictions of our world. In other words, with the complexity of the world we live in. That doesn't mean that we don't have anything to learn or any lessons to learn. Because history is a constant work of confrontation, and the historian Mark Blood highlighted the importance of diversity, the importance of alternative, the difference of changes and differences and the otherness. So historic comparison doesn't have the same traits. It comes from the assimilation of different situations that should be examined.
Cualquier confrontación histórica incluye
Any historic confrontation includes similarities and differences, but history doesn't repeat in exactly the same way.
y sin embargo tenemos
However,
que observar
we have to observe
la
that the dimension of
especialmente
continuity
con el tema
gets highlighted with the
aéreos
issue of
en las
air
guerras del siglo
bombings
XXI.
in the 21st century wars.
Espero que me oigáis todavía. No sé
I
si
hope
hay
you can
algún
still
problema.
hear me. I don't know if there are any problems with my connection.
¿Está bien?
Can you hear me properly?
¿Puedo seguir?
Can I carry on?
Es que no he escuchado la traducción y ya no la oigo, entonces por eso.
I was listening to the translation and now I don't listen to the translation anymore, so I'm not sure if it's working or not.
La figura del bombardeo aéreo.
Secondly, the figure of the air bombing in the representation of the
Desde
wars.
hace más de 20 años observo profesores
For
de
over
historia
20 years, I have been seeing history
contexto
professors
de Ginebra,
in a context, that of Geneva,
los profesores
in which
de formación tienen un
professors
cierto margen de maniobra
can really act and have some freedom
en sus
in their
temáticas, en términos
choice of subjects in terms of
para
history,
enseñar la
to
historia.
teach history to their students.
Y tengo que confesar
And I have to confess that
casi nunca
hardly ever, or not very often,
he observado
I have seen
una
a
clase sobre bombardeos
class
aéreos
about
durante las guerras
air
del
bombings during the
siglo
wars,
XX.
during the wars in the 21st century.
Mi experiencia no tiene, está claro que no tiene ningún valor estadístico.
My experience is
Me
not
permite
a statistic,
reflexionar junto con
but
vosotros
it allows
sobre
me to
un tema que
reflect
merece
together
una
with you
reflexión, sin duda.
on an issue that is worth thinking about.
Este
And
relativo
how could
silencio.
we explain this relative silence?
Que he observado
Silence, may I remind you that I have seen
Suiza
in a country, Switzerland, that hasn't really experienced any wars directly.
aunque haya sido golpeado por este conflicto por su cercanía.
It was
geográfica
involved more or less in the conflict because it was nearby other
y sus
countries,
efectos en su economía.
and it was affected in
Y,
its
sobre
economy.
todo,
But
¿qué sustituye este relativo silencio sobre las víctimas de los
there is
bombardeos
something that
aéreos de las
replaced
guerras
this
europeas?
silence on the air bombings
No tengo tiempo
in the
para
European
entrar en
wars.
detalles.
I don't have a lot of time to
Sin
get into
embargo,
detail, but
los recuerdos de estas guerras tienen su historia.
remembering
Hay una
these
historia de
wars
las memorias de las guerras.
leads to history. There is a history for remembering these
Para la Gran Guerra, la primera,
wars. For the First World War, the history of the memory
las
is
siguientes configuraciones
linked
geográficas
to the following geographical configurations described by Antoine.
han destacado antes una aproximación historiográfico,
So this has been
militar y diplomático.
a treatment that has been historical, geographically, and military. So 40 years later, at the end of the 50s,
Se añadió a la primera enfoque
we added to the first approach another approach, an economic and social approach that integrated the accounts from the witnesses
y los testimonios de los combatientes.
and the accounts from the soldiers.
Más recientemente,
And more recently,
desde los años 70 en
since the
adelante,
70s onward,
un tercer
a
enfoque,
third approach
una tercera
has
configuración
come up, a third historiographic
enfoque
configuration,
cultural que
a cultural approach that includes especially
los rasgos memoriales y las
the
conmemoraciones.
memory traits and
En
commemorations.
la Segunda Guerra
And
Mundial,
with regards to the Second World War,
recordemos el texto de Jacques Ellul,
let's remember Jacques
la
Ellul's
película
text in the
de Alain René,
film, or Alain
finales de los
René's
años
film at
50,
the end of the 50s,
que ha tenido un gran papel de
which
sensibilización
had a role in raising
en
awareness,
el que las víctimas
in which the victims,
judías de la
the
criminalidad
Jew
nazista
victims of Nazi criminality,
no estaban designadas como tales.
were
Y esto
not
ha cambiado
designated as
mucho
such.
hoy
This has changed
con la
with
desaparición
time,
de los últimos testimonios.
with the disappearance of the last
El
accounts.
reconocimiento de la destrucción
The
de los
recognition
judíos de
of
Europa
the destruction of Jews in Europe
se ha puesto claramente hoy en día en el centro de la atención.
is clearly
Pero a veces
in the center of the
corre riesgo
debate.
de
But there
dejar
is
a
a
un
risk
lado
attached to this, which is leaving aside
olvidar tal vez
and maybe
la
forgetting
dimensión
the
política,
political
parte
dimension,
comunista,
in part
las
communist
causas que
dimension,
condujeron,
of
por
the
ejemplo, a las
events
deportaciones.
that
Un problema
ended
que
with the
también
deportations.
vale
A
para
problem
los
that
objetivos
is
de esta criminalidad nazifascista,
also
para utilizar la
a
expresión
goal of
italiana,
this
nazifascista,
fascist criminality,
la doble dimensión de esta criminalidad.
this double dimension of the criminality as an internal criminality and the occupation dimension.
Hay una historia de las memorias
So there is
de
a
la Segunda
history
Guerra
of
Mundial,
memory of the Second World War,
cada grupo
and in this history, each group or some categories of
no
victims
tienen la misma
don't
visibilidad,
have the same
más o
visibility
menos según qué periodo, el periodo al que pertenece.
depending on the period we're talking about here.
El trabajo de la enseñanza a mis estudiantes de hoy en día,
When I teach my students
la
today,
figura de las víctimas
the figure of the victims is always at the
en la enseñanza de
forefront
las guerras.
when we are talking about teaching the wars, the weight of the victims in the teaching of history
Es legítimo,
is legitimate and needed.
pero también se puede revelarse problemático.
But it can also be problematic if you put
si termina por invadir
all the or take all the attention to the discourse on the past. The great trilogy of the historian Raúl Hilbert, in his book,
un término que ya utilicé para designar el genocidio de los
a
judíos.
term that I used to designate also the genocide of the Jews, is the title of his
La destrucción
best
de
work,
los
is the
judíos de
destruction
Europa.
of Jews in Europe.
Y este libro,
And in this book,
esta trilogía,
in this trilogy,
analiza al mismo
analyzes
tiempo
at the same
los puntos de
time
vista
the points of view
de las
of
víctimas,
the victims and
los carneros, de los ejecutores,
the people who executed the crimes
y de los
and
testigos
the
también. Algunos activos
witnesses, as I was saying,
y otros pasivos.
some active and some passive.
Y cuando el profesor de historia
And when the history
tiene
professor
suficiente tiempo a su disposición
doesn't have enough
para
time
tratar
to deal with
la temática de
the
la Segunda Guerra Mundial,
subjects or issues of the Second World War,
es importante
it's
para él
important for the historian
mostrar
to
a sus
show
alumnos la amplitud,
his
el
or her
alcance de esta
students
catástrofe. En especial
the magnitude of this catastrophe, especially to combat the negationism and all the banalization of the Nazi criminality. And professors not always have time to analyze the processes that led to this catastrophe, these tragic events.
El fin de la historia de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, es decir, la catástrofe.
The end of the history of the Second World War, the catastrophe, takes center stage. But the work of history is about learning how could this catastrophe take place. In my observations, there are three main victims.
Primero, los combatientes reclutados por necesidad.
The soldiers that were recruited, that were killed or injured in the front lines, in the battlefield. And this is especially applicable to the soldiers of the First World War. In the second category, we find those who were massacred because of who they were, because they were born the way they were born, the victims of the ethno-racial criminality. And in the front lines, all victims of all genocides of the 21st century, including the Jews of Europe during the Second World War. Finally, I tend to find a third category of victim, which will be those who pay with their lives the commitment with the oppressor, the military figures that were part of the resistance. And there is a figure that I see in history over and over again. Is the personality, for example, of the German women from the resistance, Sophie Scholl. And the victims that are at the same time ordinary figures and significantly women are normal people that pay a high price for this war and the war crimes that the wars entail. This category of victims is not as present and is not sufficiently present in my observations of teaching history. And undoubtedly, the interest to evoke the famous photography from Robert Capa, whose symbolic importance in Italy is extraordinary, and to come back to the collective awareness groups of victims that maybe were left aside, especially in those areas that didn't really live directly or experiment directly the effects of the war. And once again, I mention Geneva not Dresden or another city that was completely destroyed
pude constatar
by the Allies in the Second World
tiene que
War.
ser percibido tal y como está situado.
You
Tercera
should
parte,
perceive the different
la
places
importancia
where
de
they are.
una fotografía para
And
la enseñanza de
thirdly,
la
the
historia.
importance of a
Quisiera empezar aquí
photograph
con dos fórmulas del
to
difunto
teach
historiador francés
history. So
Pierre Labouré.
two of the famous historian Pierre Labouré.
Concierne la definición de evento histórico,
The first is the definition of historic events and
que el evento
says,
histórico
I quote, that a historic event corresponds to what happened
o que ya ha acontecido.
or what has already happened.
El evento histórico
The historic event exists
solo
only through
a través del recuerdo que
the
produce
memory
y
that
las
carries and
formas en las que se
the
percibe
ways it is perceived
después de haber acontecido en los
after
tiempos
it has
sucesivos.
happened.
Y esta idea me parece
And this
importante
idea is very
porque nos
important
permite
because it allows us
de forma
to potentially
reintegrar
to
en la historia
reintegrate in history
todo lo que se ha olvidado,
everything that we have
todos los
forgotten
hechos
about,
históricos
all the
que
historic
han
events
acontecido
that have
y
happened,
ya. La
and
segunda
that's
fórmula de
it.
Laborie
And the second
es
formula
concierne la memoria
has to do with memory
y también esta vez las huellas de lo que
and
aconteció en la
the
historia. Y a este propósito,
footprints of what happened in
Laborie nos
history.
dice que
And Laborie
el trabajo
says,
de la historia
in this sense,
consiste
that the work of history
salvar
is to
también
save
molestar la memoria.
and to bother
Repito, el trabajo
so
de la
to
historia
speak,
consiste
memory.
en
The work of
salvar
history is to
y
save
molestar a la memoria.
and to
Salvarla
almost
contra
shake
el ocultamiento, contra la falta
memory.
de
Save it
reconocimiento,
against what has been hidden, the lack of recognition, relativism,
contra lo que en España llamáis
what we call
la desmemoria.
in Spain forgetfulness.
Y perturbarla
And to shake it
para que no se deje esencializar y que se alimente
so that
constantemente
it
del trabajo de la
fits
historia,
from the work of history itself,
para que no conduzca
and so that it doesn't lead us to
prácticas ritualizadas que
rituals,
en
certain
realidad
rituals that in reality
tienen pocas
have
posibilidades
not a lot
para
of
contribuir
possibility to contribute to
prevención de la violación de los
preventing
derechos humanos
the
y
violation of
y de
human
delitos
rights
contra la humanidad
and crimes against humanity in the present and the future. In France, there is a small book by Sarah Ginsburg,
se preguntaba
and in this
hace
book,
algunos años
she asked a few
a qué
years back,
servían las políticas de la memoria. Alarmadas
what was the
por el
use
hecho de que su
of memory
promoción, especialmente
politics
en las escuelas,
alarm, because the promotion of these
parecía impedir
policies in the schools
el ascenso de la extrema derecha. Y
didn't
esto nos
stop
invita a
the
reflexionar
far
sobre
right
este tema tan importante.
to
Con la fotografía
move
de
forward
Kappa,
to
que
increase
constituye
its power.
una
With
huella
the
reproducible,
photograph of Kappa,
una encarnación
which is
simbólica del terror
a
fascista,
reincarnation of the
que,
fascist terror
asoló un barrio
that
obrero de Madrid, lo que pasó
torn down a neighborhood in Madrid,
encontrar una
one
definición
can
existente en
find
presente y
a
futuro
definition
a través del objeto
in the present
fotográfico y su
and the past
reproducibilidad.
when we see this object and how it can be reproduced.
Y tenemos todos los motivos para alegrar.
And we have every reason to be happy about.
A juzgar por la realidad de nuestro tiempo.
Judging by the reality of our time,
contemporánea,
contemporary time, in which the work of history and memory is especially needed.
Por esto, sostuve
That's why
favorablemente proyectos memoriales que
I
desarrollan en torno a esta
get
fotografía
involved
y al lugar de la
in these
memoria
historic memory
que ha
projects to do with
forjado.
this photograph and the memory that it has created.
El problema
To
del
conclude,
relativismo.
the problem of
Para
relativism, I
desarrollar
would
esta
like to
cuestión
develop another
que
issue
presenta,
that
no se presenta en el caso de Madrid y del terror
is
aéreo
not
fascista,
present in the aerial terror
que
in Madrid
caracterizó
and the fascist terror
la guerra civil.
that was a trait
En
of the
efecto,
Civil War.
durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, esta
It's true
forma
that
de
during the
terror,
Second World War, this form of terror,
crimen de guerra,
this war
definido
crime,
sucesivamente como
defined
inútil
successively
por el
as
historiador Wazin,
not useful
fue
by
utilizado
the
también por
historian
las
Basil,
fuerzas
was
aliadas
used by
al
the
principio,
Allies at the
por lo
beginning,
menos en la lucha contra el fascismo.
at least
Naturalmente, esto no
in the
cambia el
fight
hecho de
against
que,
fascism.
tomar
This doesn't
como
change the
objetivos,
fact that having as a target
personas inocentes constituye un crimen de
innocent
guerra,
civilians
y no cambia
is
el hecho
still
de que
a war
los
crime,
bombardeos
and it
aéreos
doesn't change the
están
fact that the air
constantemente
bombings are
caracterizados por
constantly
errores
characterized by errors
y no pueden ser
and
definidos
can be
quirúrgicamente.
defined
Pero al mismo tiempo,
chirurgically,
¿cómo podemos evitar
surgically,
poner todos los
sorry.
crímenes del
So how
pasado
can
en el
we
mismo plano?
stop all the
Teniendo
crimes
en
from the
cuenta no solo
past
las víctimas, sino que también
in the
los
present,
autores de los crímenes, de la naturaleza y
taking
las
into
finalidades
account that the victims and the author of the crimes and the aim of the actual crimes,
y del inicio de su
and also
mismo?
the beginning of the crime itself.
En cuanto transmisor de la historia y de la memoria, me preocupa mucho el
I
fenómeno del relativismo.
teach history and memory, and I'm really worried about this concept of relativism,
La realidad del
this
fascismo
negative thought that
y la importancia
really
del
doubts about
antifascismo,
fascism and the importance of
utilizando y
anti-fascism,
abusando de
using
ideas
and abusing general
generalizadas,
ideas
genéricas, fratricidas y memoria y memorias divididas
and divided memory and fratricidal warfare
deberían reconciliarse
that should,
sin ningún trabajo
and
de
these
historia y
memories
memoria
you
para el
should
futuro.
reconcile
Pienso,
for the
ejemplo,
future.
en la resolución
I
del
think about the
Parlamento
resolution of the
Europeo
European
de septiembre
Parliament
de
of
2019,
September 2019.
que es muy problemática en este
It's very
sentido.
problematic in this
Hacer
respect.
historia no
To
significa
create history
negar
doesn't mean to
o
deny
eufemizar o mitizar los
or
crímenes de
mitigate
cualquier tipo,
incluidos
any
any crime,
en este caso de la resolución del Parlamento Europeo,
including in this case
los
the
del
ones mentioned in the
fascismo.
resolution of the European Parliament. Sorry, I'm just done, I think.
He terminado.
I think I'm done.
Cuatro líneas me quedan.
4 lines left, I think.
Del fascismo y del estalinismo, pero
From the
tampoco se trata de
fascism
poner
and
todos los crímenes del
Stalinism,
mismo
but
plano,
we shouldn't think
aplastando
about
sus
the
respectivos significados.
crimes, we shouldn't think of all crimes in the same level,
El tema del terror
because
aéreo,
otherwise we will compare the
aéreo,
significance.
en sus
The aerial terror
puntuales, así como en su realidad a largo plazo,
and the reality in the long term
un tema de gran
is a very
importancia
important
y
issue,
menospreciado por la enseñanza de la
and it
historia.
hasn't really
Tiene
been
que ser
thought
tratado
enough
en toda
in
su
the
complejidad
teaching
y
of
como
history,
vector
and that
de
it
la
should be
afirmación
treated in
de
all
los
its
derechos
complexity,
humanos de todos y
and
todas.
we should
Perdón por
use them to reaffirm
haberme explayado.
human rights. Sorry, it took me too long, but I'm done now.
Molto grazie, Charles.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this intervention. We're going to move on to the coffee break in order to stretch our legs and grab a coffee, and we will resume in 20 minutes. Thank you very much to you all.
Pues nada.
So we resume after the coffee break with renewed energy, and we would like to welcome Sinclair Mackay, who is waiting for us from London. Let's see if we can display his image on the screen. He is a historian with a long trajectory.
Hello.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the technical problems.
No, not at all. I'm sure the technical problems are mine too. I'm not very good at technical stuff.
Sorry. I will speak English for the public and present you, and after that I give you the word. Okay? Thank you. Wait. Como les estaba contando,
Sinclair Mackay is a historian and reporter. He has published in Spain in 2019 the Dresden 1945 book that we have a copy of here, where he explores some important part that we haven't dealt with until now, which has to do with the moral dilemma. When one band or the other decides one side or the other decides to produce air bombings, and there were many moral problems with the bombings in Spain, but at the same time, after the Second World War, they decided to conduct the air raids. This is just an example that illustrates the moral dilemmas that have happened all throughout history with the usage of this kind of military strategies. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Sinclair Mackay for him to talk about the bombing.
No?
No?
Oh, no?
Yes.
So it's going...
Yeah.
Is that...
Yeah, I hear you. It's perfect. It's good now. If you can start. Ah, okay.
Hello?
Hello? Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
Ah, excellent. Well, if you want to start now, I would say, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to... Hello? Is it me? Is it me now? Well, first of all, once again, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to your conference. I'm only sorry that I couldn't be there in Madrid. I'd much prefer to be in Madrid than here in London, where it's raining terribly. And second of all, thank you for inviting me, because it's such an enduringly fascinating and haunting topic. I'll talk for a while without notes, if that's all right, simply because I think it makes it slightly more engaging and less stilted. But if I make any mistakes or slip-ups, I hope you will forgive those in the meantime. And I wanted to talk just for a short while about the route from Guernica to Dresden, because both these terrible events stand now as sorts of emblems of the obscenity of total war. And I was fascinated when writing my book about the Dresden bombing in 1945, how particularly the British and the American air forces could have progressed along this road, having seen what happened in Spain in 1937, having seen that horror, how then they could have proceeded along that same road that led them to 1945. What were it's more than a story of moral ambiguities and moral conundrums. It's more baffling than that. It really is a story about, in some ways, the hinterland of human nature combined with the new terrible possibilities of technology. Now, in 1937, I was going through the British archives when reading about Guernica, and particularly looking at the immediate reaction in Britain, which was one of shock and revulsion. The newspapers carried terrible, vivid reports, and they were furious, well, more than furious, and absolutely kind of incandescent editorials, particularly in the Times newspaper, which ran an enormous amount of coverage on what it saw as a moral boundary being crossed. It was one thing to use the phrase of total war, but this was the deliberate targeting of civilians, of women and children and older people. This was a moral boundary which had been kind of imagined before in fiction by sort of H.G. Wells and Sapper, a kind of science fiction idea of bombers coming from the sky and causing kind of raining fire on people's heads. But to have this happen in real life also seemed a terrible kind of omen of what was to come. But fascinatingly, after the Times reacted like that, the Nazi press in Berlin responded to the Times, claiming that the Times had invented the stories of the Guernica bombings. The Nazi press itself seemed somehow unable to process it. The Nazi press accused basically the Times of inventing flesh-creeping fairy tales. They said it must have been Bolshevists who started fires in Guernica. This couldn't have been the result of bombing. The Times and the British were making it up. Now, they changed that tune very quickly, but the two strands of, I suppose, the military story from this point onwards start to become inextricably intertwined. There were international declarations that bombing should never ever be used against civilian populations. I think in 1938, Neville Chamberlain told the British Parliament that bombing should never ever be used against, as I say, defence of the civilian populations. The Americans laid down what they thought were strict international rules to do with this too. Everyone thought that they were laying down these kind of markers. You could use bombing against very strategic targets. You could use bombing against armaments factories or places where war production was very prevalent, but certainly never in built-up areas. That was the ideal. It's impossible to say really. In the late 1930s, as the war clouds gathered, how many people really believed that? It's also fascinating, certainly going into the British archives now, as I did when researching the Dresden story, you see that kind of progression from 1940 onwards. When the Nazis bombed Rotterdam in 1940, it was not only hugely terrifyingly destructive, but it also created a firestorm in that old wooden city. And that firestorm horrifically caught the attention of the authorities of everywhere else. This terrifying quirk of physics could be the result of raining incendiaries down on an old medieval city. The Nazis came to Britain in 1940 with the bombing of Coventry, November 1940, which again reduced a beautiful medieval market city to ash within hours. The guttering was running with molten lead from the pipes. The casualty rates were horrific, absolutely horrific, and the wounded rates were horrific too. And then came Blitz on London. But those were, again, the Blitz was not intended as terror attacks. It wasn't intended as attacks on the civilian population. It was intended, first of all, to be targeting the London docks and the whole business of London docks and London trade. Now, the fact that the London docks were surrounded with residential districts, which also got hideously hit, was kind of a byproduct of that. But you see, again, you just see the boundaries blurring again and again, as they always must with bombing, because there was, apart from anything else, it was the Americans who had the phrase precision bombing, and there was a real cruelty in that, because there just wasn't the technology for anyone at that point to be even kind of remotely precise. You may have an idea of where a ball bearing factory is, or where a synthetic oil plant is, somewhere in that darkness that you're flying over, somewhere in that illimitable darkness. But there's never going to be any guarantee in the 1940s you're ever going to hit it exactly. And you know there are going to be civilian casualties. Now, Lord Charwer, Winston Churchill's chief scientific advisor, came up with a chilling phrase, de-housing the population. De-housing is a technocratic way of saying, oh, sorry, that's my, I'll put that in my pocket. There's a technocratic way of saying somehow all the bombing was doing was evicting people from houses. It completely in line with the reality, which was people being burned to death, people baking alive. And with that, you also had Bomber Command. I'm so sorry, this phone is. I'll want to put good. Right, okay. Now, where was I? Yes, we come on to 1942 and the case of Lübeck, a northern German town in the Hanseatic League, again, a beautiful medieval city. And it was used by RAF Bomber Command in 1942 as a sort of laboratory, really, in many senses. It had no real military significance or value, but it was chosen as a target in 1942. And the RAF went over there and they succeeded in creating a firestorm. Again, as I say, a firestorm being this quirk of physics whereby flames join with flames in this terrible kind of golden cauldron and all come together and pull in the oxygen with it. And the effect, in essence, is that the air is turned inside out. To be caught anywhere in the proximity of that is both terrifying and lethal. People either could not breathe because their lungs were substances that were added to the incendiaries that were supposed to set fire to buildings and stone, but also if it touched flesh, that was it. There was you could jump into rivers, you could jump into canals. You'd just be burnt to death. And it worked in Lübeck. And Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, known as Bomber Harris, had a particular fascination with what he called fire tornadoes, fire typhoons. From his point of view, he claimed that he was never interested, he claimed, in terror bombing. What he was interested in was the possibility simply of launching such massive strikes against the enemy that the enemy's morale would deflate like a balloon, and the surrender would come instantly. We know that's never historically ever been the case with bombing. It didn't work on either side. And the result of Lübeck was that the Nazis then retaliated with what were known as the Baedeck raids on England. They decided not to go for military targets or industrial targets, but in essence, the ancient soul of the country. They went for the cathedral cities, Canterbury, York, Exeter, Bath. And the idea of that was not simply to destroy life and to destroy property, but also to destroy culture and to destroy the nation's very idea of itself. And this swiveled back to Germany there. There was a 1943 firebombing of Hamburg, which created, in the space of just a few days, some 37,000 deaths. The figure just almost is too large to imagine, really too large to compute. And again, this raised a firestorm, which just simply bent the elements. And what was left afterwards was just a terrifying kind of moonscape, where, as one writer said, only the flies grew fat. As I say, it was just the panorama of kind of atrocity and obscenity. And then it brings us to Dresden, 1945. Now, February 1945. The argument with hindsight now is that the war was so close to its conclusion, and it seemed so obvious that Hitler and the Nazi regime were beaten, that surely such strikes were not only completely unnecessary, but also sort of terrifyingly gratuitous in some way. The hindsight, the Germans were still, the Nazis were still fighting very, very hard. But how Dresden came to be chosen as a target is subject of perennial fascination, because again, there's the element of helplessness, really. It was deep in the very sort of southern corner of Germany, just 100 miles away from Prague. A kind of fairy tale town in a fairy tale valley, deep in the Elbe. If you've never had a chance to go to Dresden, by the way, and if you ever do get a chance, you really must go. It is the most extraordinarily beautiful city. The restoration is, I think, one of the absolute wonders of Europe, considering what it went through. It was known. It was certainly known to a number of British people as just one of the great ornaments of Europe. Here you had this wonderful Baroque architecture. Here was a city of art. Caspar David Friedrich had been tremendously inspired by his time living there. It was a city of music. Wagner had lived there for a time, and many of his operas had been composed in Dresden. They had fantastic soaring choirs. Also, it was a city of just wonderful kind of architecture too, and it was very cosmopolitan. It was a meeting place for people from all across Europe. Now, naturally, that changed in the Nazi regime, as everything did change in the Nazi regime. But still, what made it a particular target in February 1945? Now, on the British side, they would argue that it did have strategic significance, that Dresden was ringed with factories, as indeed it was, which were all engaged furiously in war production, war armaments. That's certainly true. And indeed, wandering around the city today, you can still see some of the buildings where the factories were operating, and they're very, very, very close to the centre. On top of that, there was a very busy railway junction. An enormously important railway junction, freight going back and forth, troops going back and forth. And on top of that, troops were going back and forth along the roads too, because they were meeting the Soviets on the Eastern Front. And so, as some accounts have it, Dresden was actually of strategic importance because it was going to hit it would help the Soviet army come through and would knock out the last remaining fragments of the Nazi, the war machine. It's still, yes, all of that is possible to see. And actually, if you, as I have done, if you go into the archives now, the private papers of Arthur Harris, and also the private correspondence between him and Sir Charles Portal, which can now be seen in Christchurch, Oxford, there is toing and froing on what the aim of bombing is. On the RAF side, they're insistent that they're still interested in strategic targets, the synthetic oil plants and that kind of thing. But Arthur Harris is being possibly more honest about it and saying that we need to go for area bombing, and there will be casualties. He said that he had no great relish for it, but this was the only way to finally stamp out the menace of Nazism. There was something more atavistic there going on too. There is the sense of stamping on German culture in a way, and this is what makes this is the curious other side of bombing, that no matter how technologically adept they get in fashioning these weapons of mass destruction, these terrifying incendiaries with the jellied petroleum that burn flesh and stone alike, but the impulse is ancient, isn't it? It goes back to the Assyrians, it goes back to prehistory, which is just visiting fire upon enemies. Something terrifyingly atavistic about it, and there was something terrifyingly atavistic about Dresden. And it was noted because after that hideous night, February 13th, 1945, when the RAF bombers started coming over just before 10 o'clock at night, this was a city which had no proper bomb shelters, apart from a bomb shelter for its Gauleiter and the Nazi officials. The civilians in Dresden had no proper shelters. They were simply in cellars beneath old buildings. And these were huge numbers of children, huge numbers of mothers, huge numbers of elderly elderly people just sitting there in the kind of light bulb darkness, listening in terror as this attack from above came. And these cellars were wholly inadequate as shelters. They weren't ventilated properly. They formed a maze kind of beneath the city and the old town, so people could move through them. But that made them even more deadly because it meant that the toxic gases caused by the fires that were starting to rage above started to seep through underground. So in essence, there was no escape. If you were outside in Dresden on that night in 1945, as the fires were kind of blossoming and exploding around you, and the shrapnel was coming from all directions, and the pavement beneath people's feet was starting to hiss, and the roads, the tar on the roads was starting to melt, so much so that people's feet were getting stuck in it, and they would fall over and they would burn their hands. It's a vision of hell. It is just a vision of hell, but it's equally a vision of hell for the civilians sheltering underground, who are either slowly being gassed to death without knowing it. They become drowsier and drowsier, more unconscious, and as a found that condition, or they slowly baked to death, roasted to death, simply because of the extraordinary kind of volcanic heat above their heads being generated by not just one wave of bombs, not just two waves, but three waves of bombs that came over throughout the course of that terrible night and killed an estimated 25,000 people. But the fact is that no exact figure could ever be put on it because the destruction was so complete and so terrible that what remained was, in part, what Kurt Vonnegut, who was there, described as a moonscape, this incredible deathly landscape of kind of hissing boulders and sort of hissing rubble, of a city rendered completely unrecognizable because it was just literally no longer there, and cellars full of thousands upon thousands of corpses, some of which were kind of shriveled up and mummified. The technology to be able to do that, combined with the oldest of impulse of all, but from the moral point of view, there are two other strands to this, which was the RAF bomber crews in the skies above, who had unleashed this hideous inferno upon the people of Dresden. Now, the crews of these bombers, the RAF bombers, were in the main intelligent young men. They weren't bloodthirsty, although they were warriors, and they were hardened warriors. But if you go through their correspondence now, there's a lot of correspondence left behind. The death toll from the RAF was just extraordinary. It was something like over 55,000 aircrew were killed throughout the course of the war. Yes. Okay. Okay, well, okay, yes, no, absolutely. I'm pretty much near the end. Talking about the morality of the young men who were up in the skies. You know, these were young men who, they listened to lectures at Cambridge when they weren't flying. They wrote poetry, they read poetry, they were intelligent, they were considered. And also, they knew that there was every chance they were going to be blasted out of the sky and fall in flames through the darkness. So in part, it was almost as if when they flew thousands of feet above, they had the power of God. But at the same time, they were weirdly kind of sacrificial. They kind of knew it. If Dresden was a crime, are the crews of these planes to be considered criminals too? This is one of the kind of great imponderables, really. The other element of this is that in the immediate aftermath of Dresden, there was a kind of, in Britain, a moral recoil. There were MPs in Parliament asking questions. There were churchmen saying, what have we done? There was the bombing restriction committees and the various authors, writers and artists saying, what is this terrible, terrible thing that we have done? And finally, Winston Churchill himself, who had asked rhetorically somewhere else, are we beasts, sent a message to Air Chief Marshal Harris saying, should we be doing this? Should we be indulging in wanton acts of mere terror and destruction? Churchill himself was horrified by what had been done to Dresden, not only because he was thinking post-war and the Allies getting the moral high ground, but also because he was faced suddenly, as so many were, with the reality of total war, what it meant. And what it meant in terms of just uncountable numbers of dead children and women and wounded people and people who'd carry the scars and the trauma for the rest of their lives. As I say now, if you ever get a chance to go to Dresden now, it is they have done the most extraordinary work of restoration. It is just, you rub your eyes, the Frauenkirche, you would never imagine anything's happened to it were it not for the sooty stone at the base. But it wears its city, it wears its history with enormous sensitivity. Because the story of what happened there on February 13th, 1945, commemorated every year on the same day in a fantastically moving service. And the essence of it is, it must never, ever happen again. That sort of attack can never, ever be justified in any kind of sense morally. And that's why it's still fascinating now to pick over the moral strands on all sides of the story.
El abordar todas estas perspectivas morales
desde
el punto de vista de todas las partes. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
And as I say, apologies if I've accidentally made any slips or errors. It's one of the difficulties of speaking without notes.
Y disculpas también porque puede haber cometido algún error por hablar.
Thank you very much. Vamos a continuar con el desarrollo de la,
Let's continue with
de la conferencia.
the course of the conference. We're going to give the floor now to the next speaker. And in this case, we're talking about Daniela Aronica. Let's see if we can get connected.
Uno, dos, tres, prova, prova.
Hola, Daniela, ¿me escuchas?
Can you hear me, Daniela? Good morning. Welcome. Good morning to the conference. As I was saying, I was telling the audience that I was going to introduce you. Daniela Aronica is a professor from the University of Barcelona, journalist and editor and teacher. She's also a project manager in our country. She has founded and directed the Studio sul Cinema Italiano in Barcelona. She edits the magazine of this center. And she has commissioned interesting exhibitions with regards to the Civil War. And we have worked together with the exhibition images for the memory iconography for the Spanish Civil War. In this exhibition and this work that she did, previous to all the campaign that we did for Pedoncelli 10, she discovered that the photograph by Kappa had been used in the magazine Revista Illustrata d'Italia with a different meaning to that which Kappa intended. So Kappa wanted to illustrate the cruel war, and they took the discourse in their own hands for their own interest. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Daniela. so that she can start her presentation called The Role of the Aviazione Legionaria delle Baleari in the Spanish Civil War. I think that you are already connected, and I will give the floor to you if the connection works.
Parece que hay un problema que estamos tratando de resolver.
It seems that we have a technical problem that we are trying to solve at the moment.
Y no lo... Vale, está entrando. Los problemas del directo y de no haber preparado unos chistes. Daniela, estamos con...
¿Me estáis viendo en directo?
Sí, te vemos
problems.
Voy a darte la palabra.
Yeah, we are seeing you live now. I give you the floor right now because I have already introduced you. And so the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Muy buenos días. Ante todo,
Good morning.
gracias por esta
First of all,
invitación y
thank
sobre
you
todo
for the
gracias por
invitation,
haber
and
insistido,
especially thank you for
en
insisting
llevar a cabo este
on
proyecto en tiempos no especialmente
doing this
fáciles.
project in these difficult times.
Disculpan si
Sorry
esta conexión se hace en
if
presencia,
this-
si no,
Sorry for this connection being online. I'm not going to be there physically.
remoto con todos los inconvenientes
I'm going to
que
be
estamos
remotely
experimentando.
connected with all the problems that that
Bien, les
entails.
hablaré, como les
So,
decía,
as I was saying, I'm
de
going
la
to talk about the
intervención
intervention
de
and the
la
role
aviación
of
legionaria
the
de las Baleares en la Guerra
Aviación
Civil Española.
Legionaria delle Baleari in the Spanish Civil
Yo
War.
creo que hoy quedan pocas dudas o ninguna acerca del
There are
uso
hardly any
estratégico de los
doubts
bombardeos,
on the
incluidos los
strategic use of the
indiscriminados
bombings,
en
including
zonas
the
urbanas
indiscriminate
durante la
bombings
Guerra
of urban
El
areas
muestran
during the
archivos
Spanish Civil War. In the
sin duda,
tracking of
aún depara
archives,
sorpresas que permiten
however,
matar
it
cabos,
still
confirmar datos,
has some
corroborar
surprises
hipótesis.
that
De un par de documentos
allows us to
inéditos,
tie loose
hasta
ends
donde
and
lo sé,
confirm
inéditos,
data and
les hablaré
corroborate
junto
certain
con los que ya
theses.
se conocen y a
From,
los que también aludiré,
from some
son
documents
pruebas
that
irrefutables de los
I think
que
were unknown
hoy
until now,
consideraríamos
I'm going to talk
crímenes
to
de
you
guerra
today,
a cargo de la aviación legionaria.
together with the ones that you already know
Pero
and
para
that
entender
are
su trascendencia es
proof
necesario
of what we
contextualizar.
know
Si a
as
ello
war
me voy a dedicar
crimes
sucintamente. Hay dos
from the
factores a tener en cuenta
this
a la hora de interpretar nuevas
aviation
ideas
of
y
the
textos
Balearic
nuevos.
Islands.
Una
To
es que en la
understand the
cronología de las
importance,
hostilidades,
and
el
this
otro
is what
es
I'm
el
going to try to
relato que cada uno
explain.
de los participantes
What
o el
is
uso
the chronology,
dentro
and
del
another
mismo
one is
bando
the
fue
tale
construyendo
of
a lo largo
each of the sides that they
En esa
created over the
encrucijada
course of
entre
the
historia,
conflict.
historia
In this
militar y propaganda
crossroads
se
between
sitúan mis investigaciones.
propaganda
La sublevación había
and
fracasado en toda la franja
this international
y de
conflict
ahí
is
que en esa
happened.
primera
So,
delicadísima fase
in the
ni
first
Franco, ni
delicate
Mola, ni
phase,
nosotros
Franco,
cabecillas,
Mola, and the other leaders
pudieran hacerse cargo
could
de lo que estaba ocurriendo en
take
las
into their own
islas
hands what was happening in
Y
the
eso a pesar
isolated
de que
Balearic
solo
Islands,
Menorca había
even
permanecido
though
en
it
la
was only
propaganda.
Menorca that was
Así,
loyal
cuando
to
una
the
columna
Republic.
de
So
milicias
when there was a
capitana
column
Alberto
of
Bayo Franco de Barcelona,
militias
con la intención de recuperar
led
Mallorca,
by
quienes
Alberto
tomaron la
Bayo with
iniciativa de pedirle ayuda
the aim
directamente a
to conquer
Mussolini
Mallorca
fueron
and
los
help,
falangistas
and with the help
El Duce, por
of
su parte, tenía la
Mussolini,
mirada
they
puesta en el archipiélago desde hacía tiempo y la
people in
oportunidad de
Mallorca
convertir Mallorca
as threats. So the
en
opportunity
estratégica
to
base
turn
naval
Mallorca
de
in a
la
strategic
fascista se le antojaba
naval base
demasiado ventajosa para
was
la
too advantageous to let it go.
Esto además hubiera reforzado,
And this will
la
have
hubiera
reinforced
su posición en
the
el
position in the
Mediterráneo
Mediterranean, in
y
the
le
Western
hubiera
Mediterranean,
permitido
and will
obstaculizar
allow
cualquier intento
to
de Francia de
stop
mover un
any
ejército del norte de
tries
África a sus
from
costas en caso de
France
conflicto
to move
de
it to the north
Pero
coast of
para
Africa in
ello
case of
había
a
que
generalized
impedir a
conflict.
cualquier
But for
precio
that,
que
we
los
needed to
republicanos
stop
recuperasen
the
la isla.
Republicans from
En agosto
taking
de
over the island.
1936,
In August
sin embargo, el
1936,
éxito de
however,
la contienda
the
era muy
success of
incierto.
the
Italia aún no
war
estaba
was very
respaldando
uncertain.
abiertamente a los
Italy was not supporting the
acababa la Sociedad
insurrectionists
de Naciones de
openly.
levantar las
The
sanciones y
Society of
Mussolini
Nations
iba de
had
alguna manera
just stopped
con
the
una
sanctions,
cierta
and Mussolini
cautelosidad.
was very
Mussolini
careful.
optó así
So
por
Mussolini
jugarse
opted
sus opciones
to
en los dos frentes,
play
el
its option in the
peninsular por un lado
two
y el Balear por el otro,
fronts, in the
abordando
peninsula and the
la
Balearic
intervención
Islands,
de
and
manera
the
radicalmente
intervention was radically
En la
in
España
both places.
continental aceptó que
In the
las ayudas
peninsula,
de
he
Roma fueran a
accepted that
parar
the
todas a
aids
manos
of
de
Rome
Franco.
went into Franco's hands completely, and in the Balearic Islands, he supported the local phalange. But he could take that support away from them if the situation went wrong. And the leader was the Corsi, and he was known as Conde Rossi. So the action of Bonacorsi had an extra-official character, and it was like a perfect cover for the real aim of Mussolini. No adventurer would have reached this result alone in these circumstances. In fact, those who were directing the operations was the Regia Marina and the Regia Aeronautica, without which intervention Conde Rossi would have never appeared. Bonacorsi was, in fact, the leader of the strategic maneuver of the Duce for enough time to consolidate the Italian military presence in the island. The first planes sent to Mallorca were coming from the Society Idrovolanti Alta Italia. As Ángel Viñas demonstrated, they sold this officially to the monarch, Pedro Sainz Rodriguez. He was a key element of the civil society that in Rome he had done decisive deals for buying armament in the previous weeks. In this same transaction, they have also acquired the planes that guarantee going through the strait and reaching the African army, and that gave these troops coverage when they moved towards Madrid. So thanks for the German and Italian allies, how these people had an advantageous position, which was key for the final victory. In 19th of August 1945, some planes left from Cerdeña to Mallorca, and they bombarded the ships and also the militias campsite. So the unexpected intervention of the Italians was very adverse for the Balearic column, and then the Emilio Morandi ship came, and they had 3 fighters, 3 other bombers, more water bomber planes, more bombs and ammunition and technical personnel. At the end, we got the 3 motor planes, and with this second set of planes, this happened. Baio received the order to retreat, and it seemed like Mussolini's plan was working, but the situation got wrong. Franco was an Africanist. He was formed in the campaigns in the north of Africa in the first part of the 20th century, and this mission of the Africanists turned this war in a war destined to annihilate the enemy. So this meant that Mussolini started acting in Madrid to reactivate the offensive against the interest of Franco, without consulting the leaders of the army in Italy and without knowing exactly what the situation was on the ground. And this had repercussions in the coordination of the military Italian mission, the Corps of Troops Militari. These anomalies and this improvisation meant that the Francoist intervention was key. There were technicians, there were pilots, and in December 1936, there were some expeditionaries that were effectively volunteers. So the total of the ground forces sent to Mussolini was over 76,000 men. And the transport of the armament was the Regia Marina, and there was an underwater war against the Repubblica despite the commitments by Mussolini in the non-intervention committee, it's difficult to estimate the real numbers, but we think about 89 ground units and about 100 submarines. So the Regia Aeronautica sent about 6,000 men and more than 700 planes. For Italy and Germany, Spain was also allowed to experiment with new weapons and war techniques. In this respect, the most important role was for the aviation, that for the first time had a strategic role that was given in the great scale during the Second World War. An aviation that had the opportunity to prove the devastating effects of the indiscriminate bombings over cities. And this takes us to talk about a few questions with regards to war doctrine and the taking of decisions. There was presentation about this before, so I'm just going to say a few things about this. In Italy, in the years before the Spanish War, the debate over the using planes was the thesis of two theorians, Giulio Douhet and Amadeo Mecozzi. Douhet was defending the strategic bombings over civil population, and Mecozzi was defending the idea of an aviation that did ground attacks in small groups over sensitive targets for the enemy in the front, but also in the second line of defense, called bombing against forces that has an immediate effect over the operations that are in course. Both of them thought about the aerial forces, and this is the novelty for the aviation of the Balearic Islands. They thought about an aviation that was independent from the ground forces, and they thought about the bombings as something essential to be able to achieve the aerial supremacy. There was other propaganda that was even bigger, but they thought that it was more important. And there was another line of thought that thought that the aviation was a support for the naval and the ground forces. And so the CTV demanded the aviation during the whole of the war in Spain, and the subordination was because of the ground command of the operation and had negative repercussions in the organization of the mission. The fascist intervention also had been affected from the beginning by the strange structure of the command chain and the continuous disagreement between Mussolini and Franco. After the defeat in Guadalajara, took advantage of the situation to take all the operative autonomy from the CTV, which turned into another army, they call themselves national. So this Mussolini turned, to a certain extent, to someone who put a price to its services. So the pilots who arrived in Morocco on 30th of June had to belong to the foreign legion. It was called the aviation of the division, and this was working until the 20th of December, where the General Vincenzo Velardi took the place of Bonomi at the front of this Aviazione Legionaria. And then we come to the expeditionaries, as opposed to the division aviation that acted as an independent unit. The one that acted in the peninsula, the continental one, because of Mussolini's orders, was subordinated to the city, and its command, that had been just named, the new general, Mario Roata, had been named by the Duce, the way they did it in a private letter, and I quote, "Dear Roata, you are at the command of all the armed forces in the ground and in the air, all the forces that are in Spain, and that will be subsequently sent there." So there was no disposition to collaborate between the armed forces. I'm talking about Italian armed forces.
El CTV siguió
So the
exigiendo
CTV
que la aviación legionaria
continued to
actuara en
demand that
apoyo a sus tropas
the AL
y sustitución
continue
de
to
la
act in
artillería.
support of their
Por
troops
su parte,
and
los
in substitution
facciosos,
of artillery.
bastante ya operativo
The
al mando, fueron alternando el empleo de la aviación
ones who were at work were alternating
táctica
using the planes in support of the ground
campaña del
units
norte,
that this prevailed until the North Campaign.
península,
They were obviously crossing
con
the
órdenes
peninsula,
de bombardeo
and
estratégico
they were doing
contra
strategic
objetivos
bombings
militares y con
against
una
military
considerable
targets and
tolerancia
with
respecto de los
considerable and
bombardeos
hypocrite tolerance
civiles.
with regards
En este
to
caso,
the
Franco,
bombings against
cuando no
the
tomó
civil
directamente la
population.
iniciativa de
Franco
apuntar
didn't
a un
take the
objetivo
initiative
concreto, bien por
to
represalia,
point to a target,
tomando la delantera, prefirió dejar el
and he
trabajo sucio
preferred
al aliado
to give
germano-italiano.
this role
Y desde
to
luego
the
este no solo se
allies,
negó, sino que actuó en
Italo-German
muchas
allies.
ocasiones motu proprio.
And
El
they
bombardeo
acted
estratégico fue empleado en Cannes de
independently.
forma
The strategic
casi
bombings
sin
was
excepciones en la
employed
costa
without
mediterránea,
exception in the
donde por
Mediterranean
primera vez
coast,
en la
which
historia
for the
la
first time in
aviación fue
history the
utilizada
aviation was
para
used
golpear de
to
manera sistemática
strike
y
systematically and
continuada la retaguardia
continuously the second
enemiga
line of
y para
defense of the
sembrar
enemy
el terror
and to
entre
cause
la
terror
Las incursiones
to the
desde
population.
Mallorca
The
presentaban
incursions
además la
from
enorme
Mallorca
ventaja
hold
de
also
poderse
the great
desarrollar
advantage to
por
be able to
general sin
develop
bajas propias,
without
porque
getting any
evidentemente los
casualties
aviones
because
no
the
tenían
planes
que
didn't
sobrevolar
have
territorio
to
enemigo
fly
para
over
alcanzar
the
sus
territory of the
Esa
enemy to
actuación
reach their
le
targets. This
correspondió, esa
role,
actuación desde
this
Mallorca le
role
correspondió
from Mallorca
mayoritariamente a la aviación legionaria del
was in the hands of
cuya
the
creación se remonta a las
ALB,
postrimerías
and
de
their creation
1936.
their creation was in
Se
the beginning of
divide en dos
1936.
ramas. Una actúa en la
There
península,
were
aviación
two branches,
legionaria,
one for the
básicamente en
Peninsula,
apoyo a las tropas de
Region
tierra,
Legionaria,
la otra
to
actúa
support the
desde
ground
Mallorca,
forces, and the other one
fundamentalmente
acted in
con
Mallorca
tipos de acciones
with types of
fundamentalmente
actions that were strategic, mainly.
Sabemos que en ese
We
momento
know
es
that
cuando Mussolini
then
pretende
Mussolini
acelerar el fin de las hostilidades
wants
con el
not
envío
to
masivo
accelerate
de hombres y armas.
the
El 14 de diciembre,
hostilities
Gallo,
with more
cargo de la
people
base
and
aérea
armament.
de
Gallo,
Mallorca,
who was in charge of
recibió
the
las primeras
aerial base in
instrucciones
Mallorca, received the airfield in Mallorca, received the first commands, and then they want new
vista de la llegada de nuevas remesas de aviones,
new tarmac there in the airfield, and then in the letters to Gallo they talk about these new bombers, and also tells him to cooperate between in the defense of the three islands, and also when it came to the Mediterranean coast. And the targets was the detection and repression of maritime traffic, of personnel and armaments for the Reds, and acting with their own means with other air forces against the Mediterranean coast. Finally, they limit the role of the ALB to the area comprised between the French border and the San Antonio Cape in Denia, with two specific targets, the ports of Valencia and Barcelona. It wasn't Gallo who executed the orders, but who On the 14th of February, the M79 arrived in Spain and they acted in Guernica. The bad experience of the transfer from Cerdeña and Ador in the beginning of hostilities meant that all planes from Italy stopped in Mallorca before reaching the peninsula. So the strategic importance of the islands is confirmed. But Malaga seemed to corroborate the desires of Mussolini. Guadalajara was a major change in the power balance. As I was saying, the ALB was self-sufficient and took their own decisions. It received orders almost exclusively from Mussolini and other leaders in Italy. which was using the war in space as an exhibition for him and his own propaganda. So the autonomy of the ALB and this connection with Rome was even more obvious with the arrival in May of Pedalti, who had given the command to Mario Berlusconi because he didn't agree with the commander Ettore Bastico. Again, aviation against the volunteers in the ground. So this change was accentuated from September onwards because of different issues, because of the revenge of the CTV in Santander, the 26th of August, also of the effects of a Neon conference in the 14th of September. In the conference, there was at the end of the pirate war of the Italian submarines, and so the ALB had a strategic importance that was even better. There is a great relationship between this whole succession of new names and transport and the development of the war and the role of the Italian aviation. I'm just going to talk about the several phases in the Balearic Islands. So the first phase was the one that we have been talking about, and it started in the 16th of March and the 18th of April. There are the bombings of Barcelona, in Barceloneta, the port, etc. And in this stage, the city that was harmed the most was Valencia, where they got the most of the Soviet help. And in the aviation of the Balearic Islands, I'm going to share with you. Yeah, it says that. Sorry, I can't share my screen with you, and I would like to share my screen with you. So if you could solve this, it would be good if I could share this. In the test that we did before, it was working, but I don't know if it's working anymore. I don't know if you can make it work so I can show you the documents that I was talking about. So, the situation of the aviation then is about 6 bombers, SM-81, 3 fighters CR-32, 3 water bombers M41, and one water bombers is a Kant Z-501. As you can see, this armament was not very big, especially if you compare it to the one that we had in January 1938, where the SM-81 were changed from 6 to 11, and there were 27 Marchetti 79, the 2 bombers. Okay, now I can do it, I can share. It's going to be very difficult otherwise.
A ver. Creo que estarán viendo, ¿no? esa situación inicial de las que...
So you can see now this initial situation that I was talking about. These are the data. Here, the comparison between this initial situation and the maximum potential that the aviation had later on. Despite this is increasing, where there are more troops and resources. Despite the fact that the ALB didn't have a huge number of planes and pilots, they could do 4 services a day, and using strategically these people and the bases and the defenses in the coast allow them to keep the Republicans away from them from the beginning of the war. With Velarde in command, we could see that the rhythm and intensity of the actions of the ALB escalated. In the initial phase of the North Offensive, Velarde had taken advantage of the chaos in which the CTV was immersed after the disaster in Guadalajara to stop listening to them and employ the AL as aerial army, training the saturation bombing technique in Durango and Guernica, where the continental aviation participated. In the Balearic Islands, Velarde changed in the perfect executor of the perfect arm of the orders of Mussolini. In the 28th and 29th of May, Valencia and Barcelona suffered two great aggressions with numerous civil casualties. The terror campaign had just started. We have here two bloodbaths with the intervention of this aviation. In December, Mussolini was explicit about his strategy when he said to the General Mario Berti, which was the new commander of the CTV, Mater Bernasconi, and I quote, "The Avisione Baleari is going to be reinforced and is going to cause terror in the second line of defense of the Reds, and particularly in the urban areas." The 7th, yes? Okay, oh. Yes, the 7th of September 1937, the first 12 SM-79 landed, and they were the first group on bombardment, together with the 17th one, were the Falchi delle Baleari, and the aviation reached their maximum potential, as I was saying before. Other authors have gathered all the data of these bombings with data, dates, number of victims, the places of impact of the bombs, and other studies. But in our center, in these two documents that I consider important and that I found in the archive of the Italian military aeronautic. The first one is a map. Can you see it? The first one is a map that summarizes the actions taken by just one group, the 17th, from the beginning, the 17th of January, when it was created, to the end of between the Selva and Aguilar, to the south of Cartagena. So they came down south from Denia, and the city that is worstly damaged is Valencia. Where the people who were the resistance have taken the coast between Vinaroz and Sagunto, and the intensity of the bombings went higher because of the advance of these ground troops. And the targets were not just military. And then in the second map that I'm going to show you, it's going to help you understand it better. In this map, you can graphically see the role of the ALB between 8th of March and the 21st of April 1936. It's a short space of time. And this is a map that is complementary to the other one. And this area of the coast, the interest then was from Terra to Sagunto, and there were 494 individual actions, and there were night bombings in blue and the day ones in red. The rhythm by which this pilots' work was really astonishing. The actions were one after the other. And this second map is incomplete. The bombings of Tortosa in 15th of April, that was in the other map, it was not here, but also you can see the framework of the situation and relevant information. There was data that was particularly interesting. The legend says that Barcelona and Tortosa were attacked not only as military targets, the port in the case of Barcelona and industrial infrastructure, but also the bridge and the railways in Tortosa. This was explicit in the case of the 16th and 18th of March of Barcelona, but this confirmation lacked in the case of Tortosa. Coming to this action by Mussolini that you can see in different documents, is interesting as a modus operandi. It was not something exceptional for the ALB. So, the reaction of Franco to these bombings was hypocritical, as I was saying. Franco asked to stop the bombing on the civil targets, and he highlights this in a map. It wasn't a humanitarian act, it was a political or military calculation, and he was scared of international reactions, so Franco tried to reinforce his leadership against the Italian ally up to a certain extent. And there is another document that hasn't been really studied until now that confirms that the strategy of Mussolini from the Balearic Islands had as an objective to terrorize the civil population. It was a telegram that the General Bernasconi sent to Palma in the 21st of April 1936, and I quote, "The order of the authorities to bomb the cities is in contrast with the prohibition by Franco. I urge you that the same actions are always done with secrecy, and that no other authority is aware of those. That is not the CISA or this command." So you can see that the Balearic Island Command is completely autonomous even after the bloodbath in Barcelona in 1938, the 25th of May in Alicante, 31st of May in Granollers, the 19th of July in Tarragona. There were the most bloody bombings. And now we're just going to have a number of official documents. Do you have an idea of what they did with this quote of Mazzaratini, which was one of the last commanders of the ALB? The reduced number of pilots with a limited number of planes has demonstrated in a very exhaustive way the power of the aviation when you employ the basic rules of the aerial war, rules that even in a war and with the special characteristic of the Spanish Civil War have found a brilliant confirmation. This summarizes the role of the ALB in the Civil War of Spain. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I have gone so fast and it was a bit too long. Thank you for your fabulous presentation and with such a complete documentation. Just to close the German presentations. Now we are going to continue with the Italian presentations, not the German presentations. We're just going to end with Gianluca Fiocco. I am so grateful for him to be here physically. We know that he flew from Rome in these difficult times. He's a researcher in the Universidad de Roma Tor Vergata and has done several research in the total war during his career, and he's going to talk about Spain as a lab of the aerial war. Thank you so much.
Should I use the mask in order to talk, or is it okay if I take it off?
Bene, non so se mi sentite, ecco, se c'è qualche problema di ricezione.
Si hubiera algún problema de recepción, por favor, dígamelo.
I
En primer
wanted
lugar, yo
to
quería dar
thank
las
you,
gracias de todo
especially I would like to
corazón a
thank
los
the
organizadores,
organizers,
porque
because
para mí
it's a
es un
great
honor y un
honor for
placer
me
estar aquí
to
junto a
share this
todos
time with
ustedes.
you, and I would like
Doy
to
las
thank you for
gracias
this
por el
wonderful
servicio de
interpreting
simultánea
service,
que me
which
permite hablar
allows
en
me to talk in
italiano, que
Italian, which is
evidentemente para mí es
easier
mucho
for me.
más fácil.
I have
Yo he
put up
preparado un texto
a written
escrito
document, and
y
I'm going to move on
inmediatamente voy a empezar con mi
to
exposición.
talk about
Es
it.
un
It's a
texto
written
escrito,
document, but
pero he
it's
pensado
thought
que para
for
una
an
exposición
oral
oral yo creo que va a ser
explanation,
eficaz.
so I hope it's going to be effective.
En el curso
So,
de los
in the
años
course
20,
of the
sobre la
20s,
base de la
on
experiencia
the
de la
basis
Gran
of the
Guerra
experience of
y del
the Great
incesante
War
progreso
and
técnico,
the
se difunde entre las
continuous
cúpulas
technical
políticas y
progress, it is
militares,
disseminated
igual
among
que en
the
grandes
higher
capas
ranks
de la
of
opinión
politicians
pública
and
la
the
convicción
military,
de que en los
the
conflictos futuros
conviction that the
la
future,
aviación
in future
desempeñará
conflicts,
un papel
aviation is going to
importantísimo
develop
en clave
a very important
estratégica.
role
Desde
in
los
strategic
primeros
terms.
momentos
From
de
the
la guerra,
onset of the
gigantescas
war,
flotas de bombarderos serán
gigantic
lanzados contra las
bombard
ciudades del enemigo para desarticular
fighters
su
are going
aparato
to be
productivo y
unleashing
para
their
quebrantar la
wrath
moral de
on
la
the population in
población.
order to
Para
undermine
maximizar el
the
efecto
morale
sorpresa,
of the population. In order to maximize the surprise effect, it is
formal.
contemplated that there is no formal declaration of
En los
war.
esquemas que trazaron los
In the
teóricos
schemes
militares empiezan a
streamlined
tomar
by the
cuerpo panoramas
military
de conflicto atómico.
theoreticians,
Se dice que la
they
paz
start talking
podrá
about
basarse solo
atomic
sobre una
conflict.
especie de
They
equilibrio
think
del
that the
terror
peace
ad
can only
literam.
be grounded
Para estar
on a
protegido
balance
de
between
agresiones
territories.
inesperadas, habrá que
For
dotarse
this
de
kind of
imponentes fuerzas
unexpected
aéreas
attacks, we need to be
capaces de
bestowed with air
desencadenar
forces
bombardeos de
capable of
represalia
unleashing
implacables.
retaliation
Estas
attacks.
perspectivas desoladoras no
These
se quedan limitadas
devastating perspectives
a
are
unos
not
debates
just
entre círculos de
restricted to the
expertos, sino que
discussions
una
among
gran
experts,
publicidad
but
de una
there is a
literatura popular
great dissemination
catastrofista
of
cuenta al gran
catastrophic
público cómo París será destruida
theories,
en una noche. Y cómo
and they
Londres
talk about
conocerá
how
una
Paris will be destroyed
catástrofe
overnight and how
mayor que el
London will
gran
get to
fuego
know
del siglo XVII.
a
Se da un
greater
énfasis
attack than the
particular
Great
a la
Fire.
posibilidad de grandes
So
ataques
it opens the
aeroquímicos,
floor
tales
to
de difundir-
aerochemical
tales como
attacks
para difundir un
capable
veneno mortal
of
sobre las ciudades.
spreading
Cuando a
deadly
principios de los
venom
años
on the
30,
cities.
en
When at the
vista de la
beginning of the
conferencia
30s,
sobre el desarme,
in view
la
of
Unión
the disarmament
Interparlamentaria
conference,
publica
the
los resultados de un
Interparliamentarian
estudio sobre
Union
el carácter de
publishes
la
a
guerra
study
futura,
regarding the
sus
character of the
páginas
future
sobre la
war.
devastadora
The pages
utilización
on
del
the
arma química y
devastating usage of
bacteriológica
meteorological and chemical weapons
son
through
entre las que más
aircraft
suscitan
is one of the
conversaciones y alarmas.
most
En el año 35,
interesting
cuando la
ones
Regia
for the
Aeronáutica
public.
Italiana
When
recurre
in
de forma masiva a
1935
la
the
infinita
Regia
contra la
Aeronautica
población
recurs
etíope,
to massive
hay una
attack
reacción de
against
indignación en
Ethiopians,
muchos
there
países,
is a
porque lo que
revulsion
está sucediendo en Etiopía parece una trágica
reaction
confirmación
in
de
many
los
countries
futuros
because it seems to
que van a
confirm the
experimentar los
future
pueblos europeos.
conflicts that
En
the
ese
European
momento,
countries are
mientras
going
se
to
lucha en
suffer.
África,
At that moment, when they are waging a war in Africa for some months in Germany, the Luftwaffe has been established, and it seems to be the first step towards the aeronautical escalation. So when they enter Addis Ababa in 1936, many different commentarists write that the resistance of the Nevos forces has been installed thanks to the Air Force attacks, which has undermined the spirit of the population. This is the situation of the collective perspective in the summer of 1936, when we know that in Spain there has been a rebellion of the military against the Republic. From the first days, the chronicles of the Civil War reserve a lot of space for the aerial bombardment. We talk about the delayed character of the weaponry that the resistant forces have, saying that it restricts the learning capabilities of the military. When in October 1936 in Paris there are going to be air raids in the press, the air raids in Ethiopia take more preponderance than what's going on in Spain. They simulate aiding people who have been injured, and they talk about the mass distribution of anti-gas masks in case of war. The situation changes radically in a very short period of time. At the the moment in which in autumn 1936 Madrid is subject to a continuous air raid bombardment campaign with firebombs. It is said then that the city is going through the wrath that the future is going to keep in store for several other cities in Europe. So Spain seems to become the lab for the war of the future, the prelude of a common destination that precludes the civilization of Europe. The historians do not show surprise in their explanations. Aircrafts are used in order to instill terror on the population with the hope stated by André Malraux, with the idea of the value that of the test that the Madrid civilians are going through, and it is explained by this American journalist saying there is 1 million inhabitants in Madrid, but there is just refuge for 140,000 people. And the bombardment is going to happen because the purpose is to undermine the morale. So every minute as we're writing this, bombs are dropping on the different neighborhoods. At dusk, the blast of the explosion is so shiny that we're witnessing a wine-tainted sunrise. Even though it's night, so the curtain opens and gives the floor to the scenario and the stage of the future wars. So they are applying the teachings of Ludendorff, who in the work Total War stated that there is no distinction to be made between military and civil population. It's true that the German pilots have been sent to Spain with the purpose of learning. They want to test on site different devices from the Luftwaffe and to learn about the efficacy and training techniques and operational strategies. The test has to do with a twofold purpose. On the one hand, the tactical usage of aircraft in support to the ground forces in the Blitzkrieg, and then the strategic usage against inhabited centers which are not too far away from the front. The missions which have been undertaken are studied and evaluated. The experiences which were explained at length yesterday were really useful after the invasion of Poland. The idea of instilling terror among the civil population is well installed. After the experiment in Madrid, only the Basque cities are going to be subject to non-discriminated attacks, non-targeted attacks. They want to paralyze the second line of defense, to impede the provisioning and undermine the production of weapons. And a special attention is reserved to the fire bombs, which are considered to be extremely efficient in places with high density. And the Italian aviation wants to experiment on the consequences of bombing in urban centers, which are way more developed than in Ethiopia. Spain renders a better lab test or a test bench in order to test the different devices. From February 1937, Barcelona and some other 10 additional municipalities in Catalonia are going to be subject to air raid attacks. The aviation in the Balearic Islands, in accordance with Galeazzo's account, has been reinforced and has received the orders to throw tons of bombs in Teruel and the coastline in order to undermine the morale of the Reds. In accordance with the accounts of informants, well, they relate what they have seen to the Italian officers. In some cases, there seems to be an excessive emphasis on those accounts, as if the internal front is just around the corner. They were keen on affirming the decisive decisive role to be played by the air forces. In February 1938, the period with the maximum density of incursions in Barcelona, Galeazzo Chano concludes that it is pointless to think about anti-air raid protection and the building of shelters. The only way to be saved against air raids is to evacuate the cities. End of quote. This perspective of evacuation in the cities, which should be performed in a permanent way, precedes the explosion of hostilities, and it is very much in keeping with the ruralistic ideology of the fascist regime, because the tentacular city, which is the hub of all the generations, considers to be seen as a mythical emblem of the population against the soldiers, and in this case it's going to be higher. As of March the 30th in 1938, Mussolini himself, in a speech at the Senate, is going to expose the consequences of what's going on in Spain, and he declares the following, start of quote, "The war from the air needs to be conducted in such a way that it destabilizes the devices of the enemy, to command the air, to undermine the morale of the population. Regarding the passive defenses, the best passive defense is to evacuate the large conurbations and the vast urban centers, which are many, for those who are not strictly obliged to live there. From this moment onwards, I say the following: if you can organize the small resistance in small cities, small towns and villages, I urge you to do that." So in his speech, Mussolini remembers the role of Douhet, giving him a tribute as the father of the aerial war doctrine. And Italy will be very little prepared in order to withstand Douhet type of a scenario, and this is going to make them lose credibility in the eyes of the Italian population. But at that moment, the image which has been widespread of a warrior-like population has been well established, and in London and in Paris there are people who are convinced that the total war is going to favor the authoritarian powers. And the first ones would be joining forces and training the masses in a way that other democracies will not be capable of doing. And we have the example of Osoviakim, mass paramilitary organization from the Soviets, preparing and training the civilians in order to give support against an air raid. So from Spain there is a confirmation of a crisis of that era, and a mortal crisis at that, which includes the fallout of the European democracies. Different democracies and Western democracies give attention to air raids, and we're going to see the perspective of France and England. In France, the discussion regarding these events is pretty much linked to the conflict between the defenders and the people against the independent air force. L'armée de l'air, which is independent, was born in 1933, and they need to withstand reluctancies. In 1932, the work Il Domine dell'Aria from Jules Douhet has been partially translated into French, giving rise to a discussion even outside the strict realm of the experts. And in 1935, we have a book on the Douhetian doctrine from Colonel Vautier, with a preface from Philippe Pétain. The aerial attacks in Ethiopia and Spain are giving rise to the opposition of different theory strands. In addition to the effects of the bombardment in France, they talk about the linked issue of the efficacy of the anti-air raid measures. Douhetians sustain that nothing can prevent air raids, but some other people have or give some truth to the possibility of being capable of defending themselves against air raids. According to some, the Spanish experience indicate the vulnerability against the air and the volo rasante attack and dive bombing attacks. In the future, these needs to be monitored from higher, with a higher altitude, which is going to render the attacks less precise. These observations anticipate, to a degree, the situation that is going to be withstood during the Second World War, when the British Air Force renounces to the precision target attacks of German cities in favor of some other kinds of attacks. And in France, they discuss about the defense in the national military, which should take into account the air menace. Things have gotten more complicated with respect to 1914, when it was enough to remove the factories from the center. But now, the depth that the aerial weaponry allows for changes the whole productive organization. And it has to do with the urban orchestration, which is under discussion right now. We should get ready for a new kind of war. The experience of 1418 is no longer useful. The estimators of the air weaponry state, but this is not sufficiently taken into consideration, as stated by Mark Bloch in the Strana Disfatta. They say that the German make the most of the technological progress after 1918, whereas the French had preserved the mindsets of the trench-based war. And the British give even more attention to that, and they have a great number of military attachés and government officers and reporters covering the case of Spain, and there are many detailed reports regarding the air war.
Aérea in Spagna.
And the Subcommittee on Air Warfare in Spain drafts many different reports, which is working together with the Joint Intelligence Subcommittee from the Committee of Imperial Defense. So the aeronautical rearmament machinery is on the rise in Great Britain. So the gathering of data at that moment refers also to the Chinese case, where Japan launched a great aggression, a large-scale aggression in 1937, where they made use of air weaponry. A very interesting case is the case of General Fuller, an important theoretician defending the key role of the bombarders, and he publishes an essay which is called Towards Armageddon, and he is convinced that no civil population will be able to survive the psychological impacts of living under the bombs. He came to Spain and he came to realize that the punished cities were not witnessing the scenes of panic that he had foreseen, and he admitted that he was surprised. But even so, Fuller maintains his point in the report for the War Office Ministry, where he considers that the air raids undermine the civil population's morale. And this idea is probably linked to the fact that the Spanish conflict is not too modern because of the weaponry used or the doctrines in place. Aviations can only show some of its capacities, but the great destructive potential, our psychological potential, will be unleashed among different powers. So Fuller considers that the high-ranking officers should be warned so that they get ready. And he wanted to have more observers in Spain looking for the confirmation of his ideas, getting rid of what they observed in reality. Among the journalists, we have the figure of George Steer, who yesterday was remembered. He was one of the first going to Guernica in the aftermath of the attack, the terrible attack in April 26, 1937, and who communicated what had gone on to the world. Steer is convinced of the psychological efficacy of the air attack launched on the civil population. They cannot withstand this prolonged tension because it creates a wear out of their morale, which tends to be fatal. So he went to the campaign of Mola in the Basque Country, and he is surprised because of the disarticulation of the internal front and the productive apparatus under the German bombs. In the factories, the workers are subject to great pressure, so the work pace drops inevitably. So Steer presents a dramatic account of what's going on in Spain. So a discussion is opened regarding the figures of the future war launched against cities. Some people foresee the need to have many bombarders looming in the sky, and some people say that it's going to be more efficient to launch the attack on different targets with different spots, but of smaller size, in order to generate terror and exert psychological pressure on the whole territory. And regarding the relationship between the population and the information of of that era, there's different information, but it seems like people are fighting back and they maintain their traditions. And it is said that many citizens have not abided by the evacuation rules, that they would rather stay in their homes. In Madrid, at a certain point, they decide to reduce the different vouchers that reduce the amounts of food, the rationing vouchers. And there is a propaganda war which is waged between both parties. Each one is disseminating the strengths, and they paint a different picture of the terror instilled on the enemy population. The Republicans denounce all the terrorist actions launched by the air forces at the service of the rebels, and this feeds back the legal discussion regarding the groundings for the war. And the Spanish bombings constitute at that moment a legal lab, a legal testing ground. The need to limit the air attacks launched against urban centers is very much cherished by the British population after the tragic news, after the Guernica's attack. There is reaction of revulsion, and many questions are asked in the parliament, and then they decide to present the non-intervention subcommittee gathering in London the proposal for the warring side to refrain from bombing open cities. But at the moment there is the dilemma to have a list of inhabited centers that are considered to be open cities. It seems to be a complex question. Which cities are open and they haven't got any warehouses or production facilities that are completely uncoupled from weapon manufacturing? So as of the 6th of May 1936, they support the idea of researching about the Guernica attack and some other Basque fronts. And in France there is a position regarding the concepts of open city. Some of them talk about the experience of the Great War, thinking about how difficult it was to establish limits on the air bomb attacks. At the top of the discussion we have Anthony, who at the time was Ministry for Foreign Affairs, whose intervention is not exempt from a dramatic content. If the international community passively the Spanish bombing, we will open the path for the usage of air bombing in the future European conflicts. The war is breached all around, and this is described by George Orwell in Una boccata d'aria. So when they discuss about the French-British appeal, there is a lot of polemic in the subcommittee. Ribbentrop tries to direct the war towards a humanitarian approach against all the violent attacks against populations. And in the next meeting, the Italian delegation reminds that the war laws do not ban air raids. At the end, the non-intervention machinery is proved to be aimless when trying to defend the most general humanitarian principles. At the end of May, the question of bombarding against Spanish citizens is something which is also dealt with at the Council of Nations in Geneva. Álvarez del Valle, representing the Spanish Republic, he denounces the total war experiment launched against the vast country. This diplomat urges to research about that, to investigate about this crime, and there is a condemnation of the usage of this kind of air bombings that go against the rights of the population. And this stand is defined by the opportunity to establish precedent situation for future warlike conflicts. I have 4 minutes remaining, so let me start to wrap up. If I need to stop beforehand, please let me know. My last point has to do with the passive defense of the civil population. The trend to launch attacks against the population, which is seen in Spain, reinforces in many countries the conviction that we need to increase the so-called passive defense programs, the building of shelters, to have evacuation plans, the paramilitary training of civilians, and non-weapon-based protection. So the events in Spain generates a rise in the acceleration of the ARP British program, the Air Raid Precautions Program. At the beginning of 1937, they launched a campaign in order to protect themselves more, in order to prepare in the air raid precautions. And there is an opposition, and they consider that this has the purpose of instilling an air of resignation on the population, and they establish a parallel line between the bombardments in Madrid and in London. And the poor and those inhabiting popular neighborhoods are going to bear the brunt of that. War is considered to be something that reflects something, also the class differences. In February 1937, the Left Book Club, they published the experiments of Cambridge against the war, and the conclusion is that they do not guarantee a real defense. The promise to defend the civilians that are subject to air raids is a great deceit, and the scientific community needs to respond. The polemic against the air raid protection is also shown in France under the wave of the Spanish air raids. In both countries, the main concerns have to do with the chemical weaponry, and there is a standby air regarding a breathtaking standby talking about gas attacks or aerochemical attacks launched against Madrid or some other cities, and it's a very looming catastrophic view. And the ARP program experts go inside, go to Spain in order to observe the protection measures in place. From Madrid, they are drafting reports that are sent to London regarding the consequences of fire attacks and the consequences. And the prevailing opinion is that in each building, the civilian groups need to put out the fires. It would be impossible for the firefighting brigades to be able to reach the different areas where a great fire attack has been launched, and they also wonder about the terrible panorama when they're using fire or chemical bombs. And there is a scenario in which civilians will need to receive some high-level anti-air raid paramilitary training. Among the experts, there are some confrontations between the defenders of the shelters and the defenders of the evacuation. At the moment in France, some experts calculate that Paris can withstand the clash of an air raid only by evacuating 70% of its population, which is the equivalent to the task of contemplating the transfer of 1.5 million inhabitants from Paris. The same goes for London, where the first mass evacuation is experimented after the Monaco crisis. But there is a convergence between the two strands when it comes to calculating the number of the wounded and the number of casualties, which is more catastrophic than the reality. A statistic analysis of the effect of the Spanish raids could have resized the most alarmistic forecast, but it was the prelude of what was going to happen later on in the future wars in Europe. The reconstruction of these different episodes sees the air raid as a non-secondary peacekeeping political attempt that was pursued by the authorities and as a precursor of the nuclear nightmare. So the air raids, the Spanish air raids, generate at that moment a discussion that gives rise to the awareness of the unsustainability of the total war. So the red thread bringing together Guernica and Hiroshima is at the core of all of this, and congresses like this are to be appraised because they're building up or paving the path for the construction of Europe memory, because we're talking about the accounts of different nations and we need to string them along together, and this is important for the future generations because we're losing the direct memory of all of these events. When I talk to my students at the university, to them, total war and air raid bombardments refer to far away or remote countries like Pakistan. There is always an exotic view of the war, but we need to remind them of what went on in Europe, in the European capitals, and what has been going on. Thanks to this, we will be able of disseminating how important it is to live in peace and democracy, and how important it is to live in a Europe that, fortunately enough, has renounced to war as a solution to sort out the different conflicts. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchísimas gracias, Gianluca.
Thank you so much, Gianluca. And these last words that we've heard from you are so true, and we share them, everyone here and all the organizations that are part of this event. One of the main reasons for this conference is this one, that the new generations are aware of this reality that, as we were saying the other day, time is a continuum, and it seems to erase itself. So, to conclude, we're just going to be closing this conference. We have a special guest, because after talking for 2 days about bombings and the cruelty of the war and the effects of the war, in the end of this conference is to shed some light of hope. So we're just going to talk about peace. And that's why we have here as our guest Maria Oranguren. She's the director of Guernica Gogorazuz, which is the Center of Research for Peace in Guernica. And we wanted her to be here today because it's the model that we want to build in Madrid, by recovering our memory so that these bombings help to create peace and not to create new conflicts. Without further ado, I'll give you the floor so that you can tell us how you have been working from the horror of Guernica, this future of peace. Thank you, Marie. I was going to say Eguardion. Good midday. We're almost running out of time. All the time you need, Maria. I'm not going to talk about the activities that we do. I'm just going to talk more about the content. My purpose is to summarize the work that we have been doing. Before starting, I would like to thank the Anastasia de Gracia Foundation, Pablo Iglesias Foundation and Granzi Foundation, and the rest of European organizations that participate in this project. Also, I would like to thank the translators, the interpreters for their work so that we can communicate in 3 languages, and the technicians as well, because they are doing the recording and they are in charge of all the social media. I'm not going to talk about peace, but we're going to start with a memory that evokes, calls, and provokes a reflection. Guernica evokes memory, a historic memory. The 26th of April 1937, the German Condor Legion and the Italian Air Forces, which were allies to General Franco, revolted against the Second Republic, bombarded Guernica. We have heard this before. There were other bombings before. However, they have been bombings after that, unfortunately. But the one of these historic towns is a reference when it comes to aerial attacks against civil population. Still, the reporter who denounced through the news in the Times and the Guernica of Picasso, the plastic expression of the most important work of art, turn this into the symbolic icon of the war. Memory that calls for a purpose. The 10th of April 1987, in the framework of the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Guernica, the Basque Parliament agrees, and I quote, to symbolize the homage of the Parliament to all the victims of fascism and to ratify the significance of Guernica not only as a symbol of peace and democracy, but also of freedom and demand for self-government. Is a memory that provokes a reflection. Is it possible to learn from the past and contribute to the achievement of an emancipated and fair peace from a scientific reflection and linked to the symbol and the city of Guernica? We think that's the case. Let's see if that's possible. So first of all, I would like to talk about the memory work that we do. And secondly, and being this European project to recover the memory of the bombings against the civil population, I'm just going to talk about one of the aims of the program to contribute to the understanding of the common European history, especially right now. The knowledge of history is very important because we are in the midst of a multidimensional crisis that threatens governance, human rights, and the ecosystem. And finally, in third place, I will summarize the pedagogical learnings of memory and the arts of creative possibility for more peaceful words. So memory, Guernica Gogoratu, which means remembering Guernica, was founded in 1987 to contribute to the achievement of an emancipating and fair peace. Not a saving peace, but an emancipating peace that talks us about freedom. And a fair peace is a symbol that it makes the Research Center for Peace work. Then the memorial gets bigger in the 90s. We create the Museum of the Peace of Guernica in 1998 with exhibition, permanent exhibitions and other temporary exhibitions, and social and cultural creation place. And Astra turns into social, as I said, and cultural creation in 2007. In the 90s, that's where we do the first research of collective memory of the bombing of Guernica through the methodology of life experiences. We interview 80 men and women of the collected of the survivors of the bombing, and this research allows us to create a collaboration with these people and other people that join us from the Deusto University. Maria Jesús Cabamesa was in charge of directing this work, a collaboration, academic and social contribution, so that we can complement the history of the social memory of the victims with the learning of history to build a critical conscience. From then, we promoted different meetings of victims on different moments: Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. So we received survivors of these bombings in the commemorative acts that we do in Guernica each April. And from then the collaboration has followed, and we had joint initiatives focusing at a local and global level, summarized in the statement, "Let's work together for peace, to denounce war, to prevent nuclear threat, and to ask for the bombings against civil population to stop." At the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, we promote different initiatives to shed some light on the historic truth, and this work was recognized by UNESCO when they declared this Guernica City of Peace by Europe. UNESCO founded this recognition in these three initiatives. I'm going to mention those who are linked with the German commitment for peace. The first one came from Petra Karin Kelly, a member of the European Parliament, feminist, ecologist and pacifist, that supported the creation of the Center of Studies for Peace and the Brotherhood between different bond cities, Guernica and Pforzheim in Germany. And since 1998, we have been able to have young exchange between young people and cultural and social exchanges. The second major highlight was with the declaration of the German President Roman Herzog, who recognized the implication of Germany in the bombing, showed his solidarity for the victims, and was showing his hand as a gesture of reconciliation. This happened in April 1997. The third highlight in 2012 was the declaration done. The third milestone was the declaration done by the families of von Richthofen and von Moreau, that in their visit to Guernica they showed their commitment with the memory who remembers to, and I quote, to learn from the past, to assume the responsibility so that we can build the future, and to support places of memory that are committed with peace, reconciliation, and the understanding between peoples. End quote. Is a memory that he remembers to learn from the past. Is it possible to learn from the past? If that's the case, what is the relationship between the historic learning and educating in human rights? What are the historic references that we need today to educate for peace? And how do we implement this in educational programs? These are some of the questions that we ask ourselves in our work to face the challenge of communicating memory and history to the new and younger generations. Just to talk about one of the projects, I would like to highlight the European project in which we take part, Places of Victims, Places of Perpetrators. This information is in our webpage in case you want to have more details. This project thought about a summer camp done in 2018 together with 60 youngsters in Croatia, and that we are going to continue in the year 2022. We will have another summer camp then. Secondly, the goal of the project and of this conference is to contribute to the learning of the European common history. The European Union shows through these programs its commitment with the ideals that inspire the European integration: peace, democracy, social justice, and diversity. However, it is also needed to go beyond that and to reflect calmly about the framework, the structure that has made possible to have this civilized project in the capitalist modernity through the last 5 centuries. The European history is understood by the Peace of Westphalia if we analyze this in the continuum of the 2 fundamental pillars: colonization and war. The 2 world wars, and we have seen it in this conference, have an influence in the European configuration and is the starting point to the political integration guaranteeing property, market, and rule of law regime that sustain the democratic systems that we know. But the relationships of accumulation and the capitalist production have really affected the ecosystem that sustained life in the planet badly. Today, 15% of the population of our planet produce 90% of the ecological impact because of their production practices and the distribution and consumption in a system imposed by neoliberalism, a system that tends to the mercantilization of the basic services that are, and let's not forget about these, rights, and they alter significantly the social cohesion processes needed to sustain life in dignity and balance with nature. So to think about peace positively beyond direct violence and understood as the presence of social justice, sustainable development, and democratic act and the defense of human rights is in all the institutions rhetorics. But the funding assigned to this doesn't go hand in hand with the theory that we defend or is defended. I hope that I'm wrong. In 2027, the budget for the European Union destined to defense and security is going to be more than the funds destined to reduce poverty, promote human rights, and the fight against corruption and bad governance. So the preeminence of the economic power and the financial elites and the lack of power of the member states affects that we have new laws to guarantee the defense and protection of human rights. We need an economy for peace, an economy for peace, an economy of peace and for peace. We can't see it in the horizon. The UN, the General Assembly tells about the year of international peace and confidence in the resolution A/RES/73/338. It's true that market and technology in the digital era has changed the world and consequently the way of understanding war and concord. So war is not in the European battlefields, but it comes under other forms. And the way peace is seen also has changed. To take care of life in terms of justice, sustainability, and integrity, and reaffirm the ethical value. It's not only about avoiding war and change the military industry in a productive and civil economy, but also to guarantee human security, basic needs, protect human rights, and the respect for freedom. We were asking ourselves, and we are asking in this faculty, and I would like to take this occasion to thank the faculty of the Communication of the University Complutense of Madrid for having us here. So we ask ourselves if it is possible to learn from the past. European history, with their successes and failures, can allow for this to happen. I hope that's the case. The project that allows the capitalist modernity is very different to the radical attitude that trusted the critical capacity to question the power that went hand in hand with dogma. Just dare to think. So the proposal to have other words possible, substitute criticism as a theoretical and practical reason, but not only. They make us think about memory and imagination as needed ways that go hand in hand with knowledge. Reasoning by itself cannot be effective in front of an analysis that can go beyond. So we need to think about multiple connections. And yesterday we saw that in the documentary that we could see.
Y en palabras, sin el trabajo del físico. Es necesario pensar desde
We need to
conexiones
think about
múltiples que
multiple
den cauce
connections
al componente creativo
that
para
allow for the
imaginar
creative
lo que
component to
todavía no
imagine what
es.
is
Y
not
él
a reality
imaginó
yet.
lo que llegó a saber.
You imagine
Comprender
what
el
you
mundo
ended
requiere
up
de nuestras
knowing.
sensaciones,
To understand the world,
percepciones y recuerdos.
we need our
Sin
memory,
control sobre
our
el futuro,
perception,
menos mal que es así. En la vida
and
se
without control of the
entrecruzan
future
memoria
in
y
life, we
posibilidad.
have memory and possibility.
Memoria como capacidad
Join together memory
transformadora
as with
y arte
transformation
como capacidad creadora.
capacity and art as a creative
Hablamos
capacity.
de aprender
We
de
talk
nuestro
about
pasado,
learning
y
from
voy
our past.
concluyendo.
And I'm
La
about to
herencia
finish.
ilustrada forma
The
parte de la
illustrated
pragmática
heritage
estética de la
is
racionalidad
part
moderna,
of the modern
de la cual
rationality
somos hijos e hijas. Y en esta
that we come
crisis
from. And in
civilizatoria,
this
bien podría
the crisis of our
presentarse como una
civilization,
posibilidad
we can
para
see it as a
pensar
possibility
el
to
mundo
think
de nuevo,
to rethink the world we
sin
live in
renunciar en ningún
without
caso a su sustrato
renouncing
emancipador y
the
recuerdo,
emancipation
el pensamiento
component
crítico,
and the
sino
critical
más bien
thinking.
para impulsarlo.
We
Y en
should
esta
take
ocasión,
advantage
eso sí,
to move
asumir las
forward
responsabilidades y
and to assume the
reparaciones
responsibility
simbólicas y
and the symbolic
materiales
reparations and material reparations that are needed.
renunciar a la dominación y abrazar la
To
solidaridad
stop domination and embrace
para contribuir
solidarity,
a
to
la
contribute
paz.
to
Mille
peace.
Esther de Noé. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas.
Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, María, por
Thank you so much, Maria,
con ese optimismo para el
for your
futuro y
optimism
sobre todo el modelo
for the
que
future
habéis
and the
desarrollado
model
desde
of
Guernica
work
que es inspirador y que
that you have
esperamos
created in
que
Guernica
esta ciudad,
Gogorazut,
nuestras
and that we hope
instituciones,
that in
tomen
this
nota
city
para
our
que podamos
institutions
desarrollar
take
algo
notes so that we
similar,
can have
cuando
something
menos
similar.
estaríamos honrados de parecernos un poquito. Bien,
We would love
queda
for us
entonces,
to be
por tanto, concluida esta
or to be
conferencia.
doing something similar to
Solo
what you do.
queda
So
un último
I'm
capítulo,
going
un
to
episodio que
close
desarrollaremos en la sesión de esta tarde.
this conference. We're just going to do a visit
de los
this
presentes
afternoon.
que
To those of you
queráis,
who are
acudir a la
here and
visita
would like to
a
visit
Pedoncelli
Pedoncelli,
número 10,
10,
a ese lugar iconográfico que Robert Capa convirtió
that symbolic place that
en
Robert
la
Capa
imagen de la vulnerabilidad de la infancia ante
turned
los
into the
bombardeos.
image of the
Os citamos a las 5 de la
vulnerability
tarde.
of
El programa
children
parecía, a las 4:30, pero
under the
hemos
bombings.
decidido retrasarlo por el
The
tema de
program
que llevamos un retraso en
was
la
at
propia-
4:30,
el
but
propio programa.
we are
Pues nos veremos a las
experiencing
5
a
en
delay,
la
so
puerta
we will
del
meet
número 10 de la calle
each
Pedoncelli.
other at
Así
5
que
at the door of
solamente concluir dando,
Pedoncelli.
gracias a todas
I
las
would like
organizaciones
to
que
conclude
son socias de
by
este proyecto, la
thanking all the
Fundación Grancy
organizations that are
aquí presente,
partners
a,
in this project, the Grancy,
EVZ Stiftung, a la
y
Fundación Pablo
DZ
Iglesias, a
Stiftung,
la
the Pablo
CGIL,
Iglesias,
y, como
y
no,
the
al
Stiftung
grupo de
and the Pablo Iglesias
investigación,
Foundation,
Fotodoc,
and
a su
research group
director,
Fotodoc,
Juan Miguel Sánchez Vigil,
Juan Miguel Sánchez
a María
Vigil,
Olivera, que nos ha estado
María Olivera,
acompañando,
who has been here with us,
a toda la Universidad Complutense,
the
y
Universidad
quiero también hacer una
Complutense,
mención
and
especial
also
en este sentido
I would like to
mis
thank
compañeros
especially
de la
my
Fundación
colleagues
Anastasia de Gracia,
from the Anastasia de
que
Gracia
han estado
Foundation,
haciendo una
who
labor en
have
todo
been
momento,
here
pues,
doing an excellent
encomiable, y sobre
work,
todo a mi
and
compañera Soraya,
also
que ha estado
and
haciendo
especially
la coordinación
my
de
colleague
todo
Soraya,
este encuentro.
who
Gracias,
has coordinated this whole
y nos
event.
vemos en Pedoncelli.
Thank you,
Buenas tardes.
and I'll see you in Pedoncelli. Good afternoon.